news, we will also present tools and techniques so that whether you're new to doing OSINT type work or you've been at it for a while, hopefully we can bring everybody's skills up. In addition, we try to have guests on to present the good work that they're doing, whether more focused on Ukraine or just OSINT in general. And the hope is that by showing us their good work, we can learn from them, and also it can create opportunities for people who do similar work to get together to collaborate. My space makes use of the nest, which is the area at the top of the Spaces window. And in it, links to individual tweets will be posted. I'm going to start tonight on the far right-hand side of the nest. The first post I always put up is just the invitation to the space. But if you were to click through to it, you'll find below it the agenda. Just as an FYI for those who drop in regularly, the last week or so, when I post the thread, instead of it coming up in one thread, it's breaking for some reason. So I just post the content and add it as a reply. But if you were to look in the agenda, you'll see all the things that I'm going to speak to. The reason that I do that is so that you don't have to take my word for what we discuss. The sources are there for you. And if a subject interests you, then you already have a start for further reading. By looking ahead in the agenda, you can get a sense of what we're going to discuss. And if any of that catches your attention, whether you have a comment or a question, please do come up to chat with us. You can request the microphone by hitting the button in the bottom left-hand corner of the Spaces window. Because we'd like to get as many people involved in the conversation as possible, if you're enjoying the conversation as we go along, then please consider retweeting the space so that it goes out to more people. I think that's it for the basic introduction. We're going to be joined tonight by a couple of friends of ours, regulars who often drop in, who have each been doing some interesting work over the last week or so. And they have some interesting projects they've worked on. So we're going to hear from John Ridge about some developments in the potential use of the S-200 air defense missiles in a ground attack mode. We're going to chat with Radio and Nukes about a thread he put together where he identified a sizable air defense location near the Kirsch Bridge. And then we're going to chat with our friend Cameron, who hasn't joined us yet, but when he comes around, about a thread that he put together. It's the first, or maybe the second, in an ongoing series of threads on artillery production. So it's great to see people working away. So I'm going to start with some resources, as I usually do. I'll go through those for about 10 minutes, and then we'll get into chatting with our friends. And then after seeing their interesting projects, we'll move into more general updates on what's happened in Ukraine. And there was quite a lot in the last couple of days. So I'll be working through the nest. The first item on the far right, as I mentioned, is the invitation to tonight's space. The second item in the nest is a reminder, so I'm working from the right. The second item from the right is a reminder that friends of ours are live streaming this conversation to YouTube. I would encourage you to participate here because only on Twitter can you come up to add questions and comments. But if you do miss a conversation that you'd like to catch up on, or there's some topic we discussed before that you'd like to revisit, you can always go to the YouTube channel, and most of our conversations are also posted there. The third item from the right is our calendar. We created this because we have several friends who host spaces here on Twitter about the war in Ukraine, including the Tochny group, who does presentations just before us on Sunday afternoons. And we thought that if we had a calendar to coordinate, that we should include outside events as well. And so we're putting on talks from think tanks and universities there. If you open the web link, it will bring the calendar up in a browser, and then individual entries will usually have a link to a registration page, or if the event has already happened, there's usually a recording. If any of those, or if you see any events coming up that you think would be interesting to the folks who come and listen to our talks, feel free to DM those events to either myself, my co-host Jacoby, or our friend Planet Baroque, who's down in the listening audience, as they do great work managing the calendar. If you were to open up that tweet, third from the right, that's titled Calendar, you'll see that there are 4 or 5 pieces of media, most of them podcasts, 1 or 2 upcoming events from the last week or so. So the first of which I'll note, it's a podcast from Just Security, and they're speaking with Ambassador Dan Freed, who is a longtime American diplomat, very dedicated to the issues in Ukraine, chatting about the developments at the NATO summit in Vilnius. There's also a link to a talk by Bellingcat. It's Hannah Bagdasar, who wrote a report a few months ago that we highlighted when the written version came out on, if you are engaged in open source investigation, how do you deal with sexual and gender-based violence? Because it presents some unique challenges. She gave a talk. Now, this is their Bellingcat Premium, so I think you have to be a Patreon subscriber of theirs. But if you do this sort of work and you'd find this talk helpful, do check out the presentation. I also included a talk it was actually a hearing before the Helsinki Commission, which is a U.S. congressional commission on coordination with the United States' European allies. The hearing that they held yesterday was supporting a democratic and secure Moldova. And of course, the Moldova Transnistria issues have come up, from time to time during Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that's an important angle to keep an eye on. There was a podcast put together by the Times in the UK, where they spoke with former NATO Secretary General Robertson to talk about the prospects for potential NATO membership to Ukraine. I believe this was recorded just before the summit was held, so it may not include all of those details, but seeing the perspective of a former Secretary General is certainly interesting. There is also a podcast there. It's one produced by the Russian newspaper Meduza, and they wanted to discuss the risks at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, which is an item that we've been covering in the last week or so. And they spoke with one of the most notable experts on the issue, Pavel Podvig, who goes by Russian Forces here on his Twitter handle, about the risks at the Zaporizhzhia plant. So if you are keeping your eyes on that, check out that talk. Finally, there's an upcoming event that's going to be held on, I think it's next Monday, July the 18th, or actually, what is that? That may be next Tuesday. Yes, that's next Tuesday. And it's a hearing on the implications of sanctions evasion, money laundering, particularly Russian assets in Switzerland. And this came to my attention because Bill Browder will be testifying, and it's a matter that he's been following for a long time. So I know I follow the financial issues closely, so I'll probably tune in to listen to that hearing. So moving along in the nest, the fourth tweet from the right is titled Resources. So these are tools or reference material that's been highlighted in the last few days. I'll put some of these up in the nest individually. The first of which is going to be from Bellingcat. They did a walkthrough of a tool called Peak Visor. Now, it was only about a week ago that I personally started using an app called Peak Finder. And I'll admit I haven't used Peak Visor yet, so I'm not really sure of the differences between them. But Bellingcat does a great job with setting out walkthroughs of tools. So I'd encourage you to check that one out. Even if you use Peak Finder, Peak Visor might have a couple of little additional features that you find helpful in investigation. The second item in the nest is a link to a newly developed order of battle for the Chinese rocket forces. I find these interesting when they come up. Occasionally I've included reports on the order of battle for the Chinese Navy. And I know lots of folks here follow the Chinese military issues as well, so I thought I'd include it. The third item back in the nest is an instance where an OSINT practitioner, he's done an example of working through one of the OSINT puzzles put together by Grauhix, who I've mentioned before. She has a series of OSINT challenges on YouTube, practice runs, so that you can learn some new tools and bring up your skills. I'd encourage you to check out Grauhix's puzzles directly, and if you want to see a walkthrough of one of them and kind of learn, by watching, not doing the first time, check out the walkthrough posted by Johnny Gizmo. The last item up there is just a comment. Occasionally, we follow developments of policy here on Twitter. And it's been highlighted a couple of times that as Twitter has introduced new policies about archiving old accounts or closing old accounts, or otherwise limiting access to past data, that a lot of work into war crimes investigations has been done and posted on Twitter. Some of those accounts are dormant. Sometimes because the investigator has moved on, sometimes because tragically they came from people who were in war-torn countries and were killed. And so this is just another article noting the impact of the potential archiving policies, not just Twitter. I mean, it affects Facebook and other social media platforms as well. But their impact on the potential use of info on the platforms for war crimes investigations. The next item in the nest, so it's actually the fifth from the right. Every so often I see job postings. I'll raise them sometimes. In this case, there were actually three sort of related postings, so I thought I'd mention them. The first is actually for an OSINT job with Amnesty International. Now, I know that a lot of people are unhappy with Amnesty's work and some of their reports on the way that Ukraine is conducting the war, and I, of course, share those sentiments. I appreciate that people who might consider OSINT work, applying for OSINT work, might look at Amnesty and be a little bit wary, given that controversy. I'm mentioning it to you guys because I think it's good that OSINT is increasingly being relied on. Whether, as long as the OSINT work that's done is good work, it may be at the mercy of, administrative decisions. But the fact that more organizations are trying to incorporate this to get a more honest set of facts to start with, I think is a good sign. The second job that I posted there is for the Jamestown Foundation. Apparently they're starting up a China brief, and they'd like to find an editor for that. And I know that several of the people who come and listen to us and chat with us have an interest in Pacific issues as well. So check that out. Finally, if you're more interested in the cybersecurity side of things, the the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, who does great work on tracking, illicit financial flows, they're looking for a cybersecurity analyst, and so check that out if it's in your field of work. All right, so we're moving on to examples. I have just 3 or 4 that I'll mention, and then we'll move into the examples of our guests today. So the ones I wanted to bring up before that, I'm going to break these, some of these out into the nest individually. The first is kind of a lighthearted one, so it will just populate in a moment. But the first was one that I saw that was amusing because at the recent North Korean nuclear rocket launch, a picture was taken of Kim Jong-un, and he was drinking some kind of a beverage in a can. And a picture was taken of the can, and it was quite blurry. But one of the journalists, I think maybe one of the editors at the North Korean news, thought, maybe we can figure out what this is. And so he put up a little challenge just saying, hey, if anybody can identify this can, you'll get a free subscription to North Korean news. And I saw this and I thought, okay, I have a little while, so I may as well give it a shot. And, about a dozen people had already been looking at the challenge and proposing options. And it turns out that last night I managed to find it. So you'll see it. It should now be the first item up there on the left-hand side. And it wasn't a particularly complicated process in that most of the things I did to try to find it. Sorry, Riverside, did you need to come in right away?
Oops. No, I didn't. I just wanted to know if you got a free subscription.
The journalist messaged me and we chatted a bit and he said, I'll give you a free subscription. We didn't sort of complete the deal, but he's certainly willing to give it to me. I'll admit I didn't do it for this free subscription. I did it more as a challenge in that I don't know any Korean. And I thought it would be a good way to use some reverse image searching, some translation tools, some searching in foreign languages that I wasn't familiar with just as practice. And I thought, heck, if I get it, then I've made a connection with somebody who, has some insight into a region I don't have very many connections in yet. And so that I use that just as an example of building out your network. And so if you were to look in the thread, the only thing I'll say is it was a bit of a stroke of luck. It was really more determination than anything. I did a bunch of reverse image searching. I did I pulled up comparison charts of different Asian languages because it looked like there were two different languages on the back. And I was trying to figure out if it was Korean and Chinese or Korean and something else. And in the end, what I said was, I bet people love collecting cans. I bet that there's a database of cans out there somewhere. And it turns out that for the last 15 years or so, there's a place called the Can Museum online, they have a website. They're also here on Twitter, apparently. They came out of the woodwork after we posted the solution. But they have all the pictures indexed by year, manufacturer, country of manufacturer. So frankly, all I did was search for all the cans from North Korea, and there were only about 10. And in this case, they didn't have an image of the back of the can, but the graphics, the artwork on the side, you could see just starting to wrap around. And it also has a unique color and shape to it. So we're pretty sure this is it. The interesting lesson from this is that apparently these cans were manufactured in the late 90s, potentially continuing into the early 2000s. So if Kim Jong-un is drinking this and it hasn't been manufactured in quite a while, he may be at a nuclear rocket launch drinking 20-year-old canned water, which is interesting to know on its own. So anyway, that's just a funny little story. Kitty, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just love the story, every bit of it. And then you found a can museum? Come on. It's just a great story.
Yeah. So Can Museum came in and said, great to see or something. And we still haven't actually gotten an image of the back of the can, which is what primarily was in the photo to begin with. And so I asked them, hey, could you find this can? Like if it's in, because it was posted by one of the main administrators of the website who has a collection of 50,000 cans or something. And so I presume it's in his collection. And so I'm wondering if they'll pull it out for us and take a picture just to get 100% confirmation, but we'll find out. I'll update you if they do. But anyway, that's enough on that little story. The second item in the nest as an example is there was a launch of a new satellite, Viasat-3. And apparently it's been having some difficulties in the last week. And I thought this was really cool. We have several folks who do radio type OSINT work. And Scott Tilley does great work with sort of essentially space OSINT. and he will collect the data that is beamed down to Earth from a bunch of different satellites, who will each have their own sort of decoding process. And his thread here just goes into how Viasat, the new Viasat 3, because of its problems on launch, has had to change its format for communication. And so he goes into trying to interpret how they've adjusted their transmission style so that amateurs on Earth can continue to see what data it's outputting. And if you follow Scott's account, he has lots of reference to tools that do that sort of thing. The third item back, I just wanted to give a shout out to the losses trackers, and to highlight, this is the third item is a tweet from Nalcio, who's a friend of ours. He came up and gave us an interview a couple of months ago, because you'll see the daily loss numbers posted by Jacob for the Orcs project. And what you may not appreciate is that some fair percentage of those are newly recognized old losses, and they're still combing through data to try to find, and look through everything else that they've categorized to make sure there aren't duplicates. And Nalcio every couple of days is posting a new, hey, here are fresh losses from the summer, here are fresh losses from the early spring. And so I just wanted to highlight their ongoing dedication. Related to the Orcs project, the fourth item back is from another contributor there who I think focuses his effort on scanning for duplicates in the existing material to see if they're the same losses taken at different times from different angles. And, he's identified a couple of dozen duplicates out of I think they recently hit, if I'm not mistaken, 11,111, so 5 ones in terms of Russian losses. And Archie and others have found dozens of duplicates in that, which is to be expected. But he's making the point that, look, my work in finding duplicates is not a condemnation of Oryx's work. It's the system working as it's intended. And every single duplicate that I've identified that, they were able to confirm, they've taken out. So it's more a highlight to their transparency. Also in amusing OSINT news, fifth item back is from Caliber Obscura. It's pretty funny. Somebody brought to his attention that about 2 years ago, because Caliber Obscura has been at this work for years, that 2 years ago, a Chinese academic source wrote a paper. And so when I say source, there were actually 6 authors. And it's a paper all about how Caliber Obscura is a bot, and how it's just a social media bot meant for disinformation purposes, which, amused Caliber no end. And if you want to see the article, which is, published in a sort of captive journal run by the Chinese university, if you look in the replies, 5 or 6 down, somebody posted it to one of those download websites. So you can have a look at the paper. But I thought that was amusing. And it's just a reminder to be careful of your sources. Finally, in this block, before we get to our guests, is the 6th item back from the left is a post by our friend Language Learner, who dropped in to speak with us a little over a week ago, I think a week Sunday. And a reminder that Language is training Ukrainian soldiers in Tactical Casualty Combat Care, TCCC. And in his last update, he gave us some statistics on the increase in survival rates from those wounded in the units they've trained, having gone from 45% to, 85, 90%. And in his latest update, he noted that last month they sustained 35 wounded during their assaults, and that all 35 of them survived their wounds. So that's great progress. So we'll move on to chatting with our guest in just a moment, but I see we have a hand up. Chris, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, is it still like in the books that Oryx will retire in October? Is that still what's going to happen?
That's the last that I've heard. And again, for those who didn't hear it, my understanding is that some of his team members will continue to track losses according to their standard, and Jacob will continue to post results on losses. But it's not clear they'll continue at the same pace. And then my understanding is that most of Oryx's other lists beyond the Russian and Ukrainian losses will not continue. So several of his lists on military supply from various countries, he has many of them, presumably won't continue. There was a little comedy break a few days ago. Oryx posted that the wrestler John Cena had just followed him, and somebody was saying, well, John Cena never quits, so you can't quit either. So we'll see if that changes his mind. Okay. But good question. So I think we're going to move into chatting with our friends. And I think we'll start by chatting with John Ridge. So John, thanks very much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here, Michael.
And there's a logical reason for starting with John's item, which is the theory that Ukraine may have converted some S-200 air defense missiles into a ground attack mode. And the reason for this is that there were several missile attacks around June the 9th, so just as we were starting our space on Sunday. So we didn't discuss it then very much, but more details have come out. And apparently the Russians claimed there was a strike in Bryansk and that they, through their air defense, intercepted two missiles, one near the Kerch Bridge and the other near Rostov, I believe. And the Russians alleged they were also S-200s, although we'll get into the doubts about that. The reason I preface all this is to say it was the air defense launch near the Kerch Bridge against the alleged S-200 that then caught radio and nukes attention, which is the next set of material that we'll get into. But John, I've put up in the nest the little mini thread you put together on the S-200 conversion. Would you be willing to walk us through what you uncovered?
Sure. And if you like, there's also another really good thread by Bryn Tannehill. I think quote tweets mine, but hers is considerably longer and goes into a couple aspects that I didn't. If you want to put that up as well, I'd recommend it.
Yeah, I'll find it. But feel free to start us off.
Sure. So just in terms of kind of a brief overview of the history of S-200, it is or was the fourth major surface-to-air missile system that was introduced into Soviet service in 1967. It was preceded by the S-25, the S-75, then the S-125, and then finally the S-200. It was really their first very long-range SAM system. The design is very, very old, liquid propellant. It's vintage 60s in every single way. Ukraine operated a number of these systems that they inherited from the Soviet Union. They were in Ukrainian service, at least officially, ending in 2013. After that, we don't really know what happened to them. Presumably they ended up in storage somewhere, but beyond that, we don't really know much in open sources about it. Poland also operates either one or two systems, and I believe Bulgaria does as well. So S-200, as I said, it is a liquid fueled surface-to-air missile. Depending on the specific variant of the missile, we're talking anywhere from probably about 200 to 300 kilometer range against airborne targets. Again, depending on the specific variant. In land attack, it's probably somewhat greater due to the specifics of the ballistic trajectory that it will be flying. In terms of how to repurpose a missile such as this for a surface-to-surface role, it's first important to understand that virtually all of the major Soviet SAM systems from this era up until the present really had some sort of land attack or surface-to-surface capability. How it was implemented varied, and how effective it was varied quite dramatically, but they all more or less had some sort of surface-to-surface mode. Originally, S200 had a surface-to-surface mode that relied on the radars that are associated with the system illuminating a target. The missile employs semi-active radar homing, which more or less means there is a radio frequency receiver in the nose of the missile that detects radar reflections off of a given target. Those reflections are produced by a radar on the ground, which is illuminating the target. It then attempts to home in on those reflections, and then once it gets within a short enough distance of the target, the fusing detonates the warhead. And so the Soviets more or less exploited that to incorporate a surface-to-surface capability out to a range of about 40 kilometers, with the target being illuminated by one of the radars that is part of the system. Now, what is particularly interesting about this set of strikes is that the ranges involved are vastly greater than 40 kilometers. We're talking, I believe, at least 100 plus kilometers, maybe somewhat more into Russia, in the case of the Bryansk strike specifically. So that exceeds the ability quite substantially for that original as designed surface-to-surface capability. So that would seem to imply that some modifications were done to the missile to enable this. Because it is a semi-active radar-guided missile, there is, to some extent, an onboard inertial measurement unit, which consists of various sensors that measure, for example, acceleration along 3 axes, angular velocity sensors or gyro sensors to measure the rotation of the missile. And using some sophisticated math, you can take those acceleration and angular velocity measurements and turn them into estimates of position and velocity at any given time. And you can use that to navigate with some level of precision. What's interesting here is that, as far as I'm aware, the onboard sensors for S200, I'm not sure that they actually include accelerometers. I know they have angular rate sensors, which are necessary for it to actually perform proportional guidance. For it to home in on the target, it has to have some sort of angular rate sensor, but it doesn't technically need an acceleration sensor of some kind, I think. So that suggests to me that the IMU was possibly in some way modified to support an extended suite of sensors to enable this INS capability. The other major hurdle here would be that, as far as I'm aware, the electronics associated with the onboard guidance computer and its software are probably not easily modifiable. It's probably largely hard-coded on there, just given the nature of mid to late 60s electronics, especially mid to late 60s Soviet electronics. So that suggests to me that there was also probably at least some modification to the overall guidance, navigation, control hardware beyond just sticking on some additional, accelerometers, etc. Now, in terms of what we'd be looking at for effects here, this would give you more or less a ballistic missile with a range of probably 300, 400 kilometers, somewhere in that ballpark. And the issue fundamentally there is, even with an inertial navigation system, you're not going to get fantastic precision, especially not 400 kilometer range. All inertial navigation systems, they suffer from drift, which is the result of error in those sensor measurements. When each of those accelerometers takes an acceleration measurement, or when each of those angular rate sensors takes an angular velocity measurement, there's always a small amount of plus minus error on that. And if you go through the math to turn that, those acceleration measurements into position estimates, that essentially constant error in measurement becomes a quadratic error in position with respect to time. So every time, if you double the time of flight, your position error increases by a factor of 4. So for particularly long flight times such as this, your error is going to be enormous. We're probably talking on a circular error probable here on the order of several hundred meters. So I'm not sure what particular, military utility one could get out of this. Obviously, a potential solution to this problem is to modify some sort of GNSS, Global Navigation Satellite System module, like GPS, GLONASS, Baidu, Galileo, for example, onto that as part of the overall scheme of upgrades that was done to presumably enable this. That can correct the issue to some extent, but I would not be optimistic, at that being capable of bringing the error down to a level anywhere comparable to, I guess, a modern precision-guided munition by any stretch of the imagination.
So I know that for months now, Russia has been using the S-300 in a ground attack mode. I saw from your thread that, in theory, both the S-200 and S-300 are capable of it. It sounds like it's a much more difficult modification for the S-200 because it's liquid fueled and it may not have the...
Well, no, it's not because it's liquid fueled, sorry. So the reason why is because S-300 and S-200 have I shouldn't say fundamentally, they have substantially different guidance principles. So S-200 is semi-active radar homing, whereas S-300 as well as S-400 is what's known as seeker-aided ground guidance, which is a variation of track via missile guidance, which is itself an evolution of semi-active radar guidance. So more or less what 5V55 and 48N6, which are the two interceptors used by S-300 and S-400, or S-300P, I should say, and S-400. Essentially what they do is they have a onboard radar receiver like S-200, but rather than having just an inertial measurement unit, they have a full onboard inertial navigation system from the start. And essentially, it also has a data link back to the launching station. So what happens is once the search radar has identified a target and the fire control radar has illuminated it, a predicted intercept point is computed. The missile is then launched and navigates under inertial navigation to that predicted intercept point. And then I believe it's at that point, actually, that the fire control radar will illuminate the target and it'll begin terminal homing based upon that radio frequency reflection. And that entire time during flight, essentially what's happening is both when the seeker is taking in that radar reflection, the onboard guidance computer is computing a guidance solution to navigate the missile towards its target, but simultaneously it's data linking essentially the readings from that radar receiver back down to the ground station. The ground station is in parallel computing a guidance solution, which is then transmitted back to the missile. And those two guidance solutions are then compared, and I believe they're essentially summed or averaged together more or less. And that's used as the final input into the guidance system. And that was the Soviets' way of addressing electronic hardening against electronic warfare, which is a common concern with track via missile guidance. That was their approach to it. The U.S. had a completely different approach to that problem, but that's neither here nor there. So that the fact it has a complete onboard inertial navigation system as a result of employing seeker-aided ground guidance, unlike S-200, which just has essentially a partial IMU, as far as I'm aware, to enable semi-active radar homing. That's what makes the difference here.
Thanks for that. That's a lot more detailed than I've been able to get into. Exit, go ahead.
John, is it easier to modify these legacy systems than it is to produce new systems? Like we've heard that Ukraine has had some issues with their productions of different munitions, things like that. Is it just easier to modify these, or I guess sorry, my dog is sighing there. My apologies to everybody. And I guess how many of them do they have, or do we know?
So, in terms of which is easier, which is, more expensive or more time consuming or less, as the case may be, it's going to be on a case by case basis, I suspect. To some extent, modifications can be easier, but it really depends on what you're modifying and how old what you're modifying is. In the case of S200, I'm genuinely not sure why they chose to do this. I can't imagine it was worth whatever time and effort they put into this. Maybe there's some 4D chess I don't see going on here, but this does not seem like a project that would have good return on investment.
Well, so that begs the question, John. There were 3 reported strikes or 3 reported attempts by the Russians, Bryansk, near the Kerch Bridge, and over toward Rostov. The only one I had heard that those latter 2 were unlikely to be S-200, given the range involved. There was wreckage, but the wreckage wasn't really identifiable or helpful in identifying. Are we aware of evidence that the Bryansk strike likely was S-200?
Yes, so there is a very clear video of the Bryansk strike where you can very clearly see a massive S-200 streaking in and then contacting the ground and detonating. So that is totally conclusive evidence. We have literal video of an S-200 crashing into a random building in the middle of nowhere in Bryansk.
But are you also skeptical about those other Russian claims of the interception, or is it just unclear because we don't have evidence?
So in the case of Rostov, I consider Rostov and Kerch a little bit different in this regard because I think Rostov was a few days before Bryansk, and I believe Kerch and Bryansk happened on the same day within hours of each other. So in both cases, in both Rostov and Kerch, as far as I'm aware, we never saw any conclusive evidence that it was in fact S-200 that the Russians are trying to engage. I'm not sure. I haven't looked into Rostov super closely, so I'm not sure if we even have conclusive evidence that Russian air defense was even engaging something beyond some general public statements. I'm not sure if we ever got any videos of SAM launches or anything like that. But in the case of Kerch, there was definitely a surface-to-air engagement. We saw what seems to be an S-300P battery salvoing interceptors at something, but I never saw any specific evidence that was S-200. Now, what I would say, what I think does make Kerch different from Rostov is it was quite literally the same day, within a few hours of Bryansk. So I'd say it's a little bit more plausible that Kerch was S-200. I'd say it's within the realm of possibility, but we just don't have any specific evidence. Rostov is kind of a black hole.
Okay, so we'll run through hands. I apologize, I didn't see the order. I'm going to go Radio and Nukes, Cameron, and then Chris. Go ahead, Radio.
I have a specific question for John. Do you know on the S-200 what the control surfaces are actuated by? Is it an open loop system? Is it something that would have a finite amount of compressed gas, or however they do it, gas generator, whatever they use to move those?
I'm not. So I have a detailed schematic of the interceptor. I still have not been able to parse the Russian on it, even with some translation software. So I'm not really sure at this point. But I guess in terms of guidance, or I should say more specifically in terms of aerosurface actuation, the thing that's most interesting in that respect to me is that per some Russian sources I read, ordinarily when it fails to essentially when it loses acquisition of a target and then fails to reacquire it, it's supposed to trigger a guidance sequence that will essentially cause all of the control surfaces to steer the missile basically upward as much as possible away from the ground and then detonate the warhead. So in order to enable that surface-to-surface capability, that seems like a feature they would have needed to in some way disable.
So you heard it here. If you speak Russian and you like deciphering Russian on missile schematics, then hit John up because you can help him out parsing how these things are designed. Cameron, go ahead.
Yeah, so John, I've been looking at a lot of the like Russian production facilities for like whether it's like tanks or artillery ammo, and sometimes they only have one or two major facilities that are producing each thing. Does Ukraine have the capability to strike that production? And when do you expect things like the Sapsan or Grom? I mean, it has like 15 different names. When do you expect stuff like that and domestic Ukrainian cruise missiles to come online? I know we've seen some of the converted drones, but I'm kind of wondering what their target choice is, because I would almost think that they might want to go after some of that industrial capacity. But so far, it seems to be a little bit more so going after bridges and active military installations, which still makes sense. But I just think these are very valuable targets to strike. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on when Ukraine might be able to strike them and the type of systems that might come online.
Right. So actually, earlier this week, I spoke to some folks that I know who work in more or less manufacturing engineering in the defense sector. And we had a pretty long discussion about this. And the interesting insight that they gave me was, in terms of kinetic action, directly prosecuting the industrial facilities is probably going to be not feasible. Even if you set aside kind of the range issue, the fundamental issue with trying to directly target the manufacturing infrastructure itself is that, on the one hand, you're usually dealing with very large buildings, and given the size of the warheads involved, even with a couple 100 pounds of high explosive, you're going to need multiple munitions against multiple parts of the building. You may not necessarily know what's in what part of the building. And even if you do manage to successfully strike the building with all of your munitions in all of the correct places, in actual practice, historically, our experience has been that it's actually kind of difficult to destroy the manufacturing infrastructure inside the buildings. We had enormous issues with this, particularly in the Second World War. There's a exceedingly long volume of analysis published by the U.S. government in the aftermath of the Second World War. It's called the Strategic Bombing Surveys, where basically we went through Germany and Japan, all of their major industrial facilities after the war during the occupation, and we more or less we did a massive battle damage assessment for the entire, strategic bombing campaigns that we waged during the Second World War. And the overwhelming conclusion was that direct strikes against industrial and manufacturing capacity were essentially totally or almost totally ineffective, because even in the cases where we were able to repeatedly strike buildings, we usually failed to destroy the actual manufacturing equipment inside. And the other issue that's more so unique to modern manufacturing is that, whereas historically manufacturing equipment, machine tooling, etc., was much more specialized in terms of the products or the specific manufacturing lines, the specific piece of tooling or manufacturing equipment could be used for. Especially nowadays with modern CNC, computer numerical controlled manufacturing equipment, that isn't really the case. You have a lot more flexibility in what you can do with your machine tooling and your manufacturing equipment. You can produce a lot more products using a smaller set of infrastructure, if you will. So that means that it's going to, all the stuff inside all that infrastructure is going to be much easier to replace. And moreover, that CNC aspect of it, the automation, has kind of shifted the value of the target away from the physical manufacturing infrastructure itself to the people working there. So really, in a modern factory that's producing, say, armored fighting vehicles, the most valuable asset in the building is not the manufacturing infrastructure. It's the people working there. So you don't really want to you don't want to destroy the infrastructure. You want to kill the people working there. And that is, from a weapon hearing standpoint, that is considerably more difficult to do reliably for obvious reasons. So it would be a very, very difficult target set. The Russians could probably also relocate some of the facilities with time. This may be something that Ukraine chooses to do against a specific set of targets if they think it's worth the difficulty of doing it. There may be reason for them to do that. What I think is probably more likely is if they want to impair Russia's war manufacturing capacity, they're going to need to target things that are logistically upstream. So rather than targeting, for example, manufacturing, they should probably target raw resource inputs. The big thing that comes to mind is POL, petroleum, oil, and lubricant facilities. That often tends to be, in terms of kinetic option, in terms of things that you can prosecute kinetically, that tends to be the Achilles heel. That was Germany's Achilles heel, while basically every other aspect of our strategic bombing campaign was totally ineffective. Our campaign against their POL infrastructure was absolutely catastrophic for them.
Do you think it changes, like, when you have, like, one centralized facility? Like, I know when we're talking about Ukrainian production, they're under missile attack constantly. They have spaced it out. It is not at one location. But, like, when I'm looking at these plants, I know they may be tough to destroy, but, for example, like ammunition, there is a single 152 millimeter ammunition plant in Russia, and there is only one single company producing that ammunition. And with some of the armored vehicles, they only have one manufacturer. So, like, I was wondering, like, from a logistical aspect, would that make it better? Because even if you disrupt production for a few months at most, that still might be hundreds of thousands of shells or a lot of vehicles in terms of a difference. But from the sounds of it, you're making it sound like they won't do that unless they get a surplus of ammunition, or it's not the most critical target to go after.
I would say it's relative to the amount of effort they would have to put in to achieve, significant effects. It's probably not fantastic return on investment. If they really want to hit the Russian defense industry, I suspect they may try to target, again, those upstream logistical inputs, POL and other raw resource inputs. That would probably be more effective. Maybe ball bearings, for example. There's various other items that are critical. So really all these manufacturing processes. You are correct that dispersion centralization doesn't help that much in terms of, I should think how I should phrase this. So having centralized facilities on the one hand hurts the Russians because it is to some extent easier to do targeting because everything's, pretty concentrated within a single small area instead of spread over many smaller areas, or many larger areas, I should say. On the one hand, to some extent, I would imagine that's mitigated by, again, kind of this large building effect where it may be, in a single large building as opposed to many small buildings, but then you kind of run into the issue of, well, you still have to put a very large number of munitions into this single building and multiple parts of it to be able to achieve good effects. So to some extent, I suspect it probably isn't beneficial to them, but probably the magnitude of that impact is probably not all that massive, I would guess. Now, if you're working in a plant that's doing high explosives and stuff like that, I would say dispersion is probably just better, just because you don't want to put everything in a massive plant that's just going to cook off.
Thanks for that. We'll take a last question from Chris. Go ahead, Chris.
I was just wondering, from what I've read regarding the S-200 missiles, it would not be possible for Ukraine to mount a larger warhead on it. So if my question is that correct? And if so, I mean, interceptor missiles have a quite small warhead, so you were doubtful they would be able to hit anything with it, but assuming they actually would hit something with S-200, what would they actually be able to destroy, since it's probably a rather small warhead?
I mean, my thought on that is that the precision is probably going to be so bad that no conventional warhead is going to be able to reliably achieve effects on target unless they've really, really managed to get the precision decently good with like a GNSS module or something similar. Just with for example, a 500 meter CEP, you need a gargantuan conventional warhead, or you need a tactical nuclear warhead to be able to achieve any kind of or cluster munitions to achieve any kind of effects on target reliably. So I'm not sure really how much being able to modify the warhead mass helps them or hurts them, because I suspect it it just may not be a point to be canceled out by the lack of precision in any case. Even if they could increase it, would be my guess.
Yeah, I also wanted to say, like, with the S-200, John's mentioned this before, it has an extremely large warhead for it being an air defense missile. So its warhead is actually almost 500 pounds, which is pretty similar to some of the tactical missile systems we've seen, and more than something like a Gimler's rocket. So this probably has the biggest warhead of any air defense missile I've seen. But I just wanted to state that. So it's not like it's carrying 100 pounds or 5 pounds of explosive.
It carries a larger warhead than attack. Well, about the same size warhead as attack. I'm something slightly smaller, just as a point of reference.
So, John, one last question for you from the audience. It's not on the S-200, but a listener who appears to...
Your mic's having problems, Michael.
Sure, just one second.
I'll just take the moment to remind people to retweet the space using the button at the lower right hand of the of your phone. It's either black or purple. And if you have any questions or you want to bring anything to the attention of any of the speakers, please do request the mic and we'll try and bring you up. I think you're back, Michael. Or not. The other one other point I wanted to make is, if you do come up as speaker and you want to bring anything to the attention of the speakers, like put something up in the nest or for discussion or to raise further questions with any of the speakers, I'd ask if you just raise your hand and bring the resource that you're bringing to our attention, raise it in a question or a comment. That would be great.
Michael's almost back. I can see he's restarting.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. That's a glitch in the emulator that I run this space in. Sorry, John. One last question came from the audience. Somebody who is, I think, maybe based in Korea, had a question. I think there were reports earlier this week about potential ammunition. I think it was a post by Ukraine Weapons Tracker. Potential ammunition that looks similar to, I think it was like Grad rockets that may have come from North Korea.
I'm familiar with the post. Yes.
Yeah. What do you think about that? I think that was their question.
I mean, so let's assume, for the sake of argument, that it is actually from the DPRK from North Korea. The identification was the whoever originally I'm not sure if it was UA Weapons Tracker. I think it might have been somebody else. I think maybe UA Weapons Tracker picked it up from them, I think. But in any case, there was a decent bit of professional uncertainty in that identification. So let's just assume for the moment that it is a DPRK rocket. My first thought would be, if it is a DPRK rocket, that almost certainly means it's a re-export. So it would be a rocket that North Korea exported to somebody else, probably two or three decades ago, and they then re-exported it to Ukraine. That would be, if it is in fact a North Korean rocket, I think that's probably the only plausible pathway for how they could have acquired it. I guess it's possible it could have been seized if North Korea was trying to export it somewhere, and the U.S. or somebody else seized it, and we had it sitting in a warehouse for 10 years or something like that. That's a possibility, but I don't know of any, off the top of my head, I don't know of any major, seizure of North Korean heavy armaments at sea in, recent years.
It would have dated to the 90s if it had happened, most likely.
Fair enough. Well, thanks for that. So, John, thanks very much for coming up to chat about that. It was a little mini update, but we get lots of technical questions like that, so hopefully you'll come and join us again. Okay, we'll move on to Radio and Nuke's update, and his thread is now the first item in the nest. And as I mentioned earlier, I think part of what caught Radio and Nuke's attention was video of air defense systems near the Kerch Bridge firing at what the Russians ultimately claimed was an S-200. But Radio and Nukes, maybe you can take it from there and explain to us why it caught your attention that you wanted to dig deeply in on this one.
Certainly, Michael. Well, I've been looking at these sites for a while, and when I saw that launch, I had a really good idea in my head where the launch site was, because I have been watching the Kerch Air Defense radar site. Turns out that's not where it came from, but we'll get into that in a minute. If everybody could, if they want to follow along, I'm going to describe some imagery. So if you could pull up my post that's in the nest, the thread that's in the nest there, and it's the one that starts with, we have a big one here, and we'll kind of go over some things. But yeah, that image showed up on the 9th, I believe, and it just didn't look right. I know there were some posts coming out. There were 2 videos. I concentrated on one of them that could actually be geolocated. The other one was heavily cropped, and there was no chance in geolocating it. But it went around saying that other video was Panzer, and I don't have it linked in here. You can find it, but it was pretty obvious that it wasn't, because as John had said to me in a DM, the burn time of Panzer is like 1.5 seconds, and this was well over that. So we started looking around, knowing that it was probably a larger missile system, you know, most likely S-300, 400. And so the first thing that happened was we tried to geolocate the video and ran into, I mean, we thought we had it, and that E97 highway that goes across the Kerch Bridge is just constantly being changed. The imagery dates are vastly all over the place, between like Yandex and Bing Maps and Google imagery, and you know, all of the free imagery that anyone could access. It was all over the place, and that's what we typically go to first because it's free. Well, I couldn't find the site. I had a good idea where it was, and then sometime the next day after we had started talking about this, I got a tip from SciIntel giving me an idea where one of the sites was. So we had found that site, and that's actually in the 3rd tweet in the thread that I linked, and that is the top right one there, and it is the titled, if you pull the image up, Russian Air Defense Launch Site 10 kilometers northeast of Kerch. So we dug into that site, and this one was new to us. It hadn't shown up. There was some mild activity on the Google Earth imagery, but nothing major, and it turns out this was probably a pre-prepared site that had been there since Soviet times. Several of their air defense sites are in old Soviet sites, since they probably already had site surveys and everything done. Well, we did the analysis of this site, and it is a S-300 or 400 site. It's really difficult to tell exactly from the air if it's a 300 or 400 site in most cases, especially with this planet imagery that is, 80 centimeters, give or take. It's a little difficult to tell, so I didn't want to come out and say this is 300 or 400. We cataloged that site, which got me thinking, we're going to have to geolocate this imagery. It just kept running into roadblocks, roadblock after roadblock. And I'll tell you one thing that you need to do if you're ever going to geolocate something. Pick one thing in there, try to geolocate it, and if you run into problems, stop looking for that one thing, because things change. Our imagery was a few years old. Well, it turns out the large blue sign that we were using was not in the Google imagery. So I drove past it in Street View probably 10 times. And I'd mainly started looking on the west side of the bridge, the Ukrainian side of the bridge. Well, it turns out it was on the Russian side. And finally, and I should have done this at the beginning, I just put the post out there. Has anybody geolocated this? It would be a really big help in the analysis. And lo and behold, I'm going to give all the credit where it's due here. because several of us worked on it. But the person that found it was an account called Downhill Hand, and I think they had 4 followers at the time. And he posted, "I'm no geo, but is this it? No sign, but power lines behind the trees," and gave me a Latin lawn. I pulled that up, and it was a perfect match. The fence beside the road, I guess they're supports for some kind of agricultural trellises, they looked right. The street lights, there are multiple lights on a single pole, those looked right. And the sensor bridge or sign bridge, whatever you call it, that goes over the road looked right. And then the tree line as well matched nearly perfectly. Well, the cool part about finding this was we got an extremely accurate line of sight because we could see pretty accurately the number of stripes in the highway. And you could extrapolate those to where exactly the car was at the time, or the point of view the picture was taken from. And you had the missile trails coming up. Well, the missile trails were almost perfectly in line with those street lights. So we could draw a line between the car and the street lights and just extrapolate that line out. And if you look at the second image in the first tweet of the thread, you'll see where I took the planet imagery that we purchased and overlaid it in Google Earth and drew that line out. Well, that line goes straight through where we suspect a Panzer S1 was sitting, and right beside it there are some either S300 or 400 tells and a 92N6 radar, which is the engagement radar needed to guide those missiles to a target.
Is it the red line you're talking about?
The red line, yes.
Okay, thanks.
So right there, we knew we had a perfect match. And from there, we went on to do analysis of the sites. And I would like to thank A Dog with No Idea, which is Stranick_1981. His image is on several of these, his avatar and his Twitter handle. But he was a huge help into this, identifying these sites. And I also worked with John Ridge, and we identified with some confidence what we had at the site. And yeah, here we are. So we uncovered one unknown site, and then shortly after uncovered another unknown S300, S400 launch site. If you look at the overview image, which is in the bottom left of the first tweet, you'll kind of see where everything was. The first site the first site that I had known about that really threw me off was the one called the Kerch radar site, which is on the west bank of the southwest of the city of Kerch there. And if you look northeast of there, that's where we found the Kerch launch site, is what I'm calling it. We don't have names for these, but it is the well-in-placed launch site. And then after we had the image, we found this third launch site, which was on the Russian side. And it looks much newer and much less prepared than some of the other sites. And with that, we also uncovered some new construction there near the Kerch radar site. And we dug pretty deep into this, and it's been quite the ride. I'll tell you one thing, and then I will kind of go to questions or give it back to Michael for a second. But I did this kind of analysis on an island for so long, and having others to work with has really made a difference. So if you're going to do anything like this, I do encourage you to work with others. I had a lot of help. Everybody's listed here. And I just want to make sure I give credit where credit's due. So I think at this, we can take some questions, or if Michael, if you have anything, or
yeah, well, I'm happy if anybody else has questions. I do have one or two. Mm-hmm. So you had already been monitoring the radar location, as I understand it. When you and that last site that you found, you did that primarily through the geolocation, because you could line it up. but the middle site, which was back on the Ukrainian side of the bridge, I think you said Psi International found that. Do you know how he found that site? Because my understanding is the satellite imagery is fairly expensive, and so you can't really just be scanning, in satellite imagery. As in, you had to buy the imagery once you identified the last site, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm just curious how he found that second one.
He found that second site using Sentinel-2 imagery, which is a lower cost option. It is a 5-meter resolution, I think. It's very low resolution compared to what we're used to seeing on Google Earth. But the big thing you can do with Sentinel imagery is, if you use the EO hub, you can make a animated GIF, or just an animation of a site, and you can fade back and forth and see changes over time. And he had been watching that entire area, pretty much all of Crimea, because he actually gave me information about another site on the far other side of Crimea. And I believe they just watch and look for changes over time. And that is a huge resource when using the Sentinel EO browser. Even if you don't have a paid subscription, you can't export the animated GIF, but you can go in and do the compare. And if you find two images, you can, or more than two, you can use a little slider and go back and forth and compare one date to another, and it will show you if something has changed visually. And that's how he found those sites.
Interesting. Okay, we'll go to Cameron and then to Kitty. Go ahead, Cameron.
So, Radio, do you think when you're finding these air defense sites, you're using a lot of the same techniques that intelligence agencies may use? So when you're sorting through all this imagery, I know they probably have access to a lot more technology and they don't have to worry about cost, but do you think some of this might apply to what people at the Defense Intelligence Agency or the Geospatial Agency or the CIA are doing to tell the Ukrainians where these sites are? So would you say that there's people in intelligence that might have more tools but are doing something very similar to you? Or is there a different way they're identifying these sites?
I would guess that some of this goes on, but I would imagine the primary way that they're going to find these sites is based on ELINT. All of these sites have got high-powered radars, and the U.S. and NATO have a fleet of amazing ELINT satellites that can pinpoint these emissions almost instantly. So I would assume that they find a general vicinity based on ELINT and then have to drill down on satellite imagery. But they probably do, and I have this is pure speculation, but I would think that when they see something like missile launches, that they would attribute it to a site and have a database and be able to look back and see if anything's changed, or what shot it, what incoming missile, and so on.
Kitty, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you know what you ended up paying for that satellite, the low-res satellite? And I have one other quick question.
So the EO hub, you can actually just use it for free. It doesn't need a subscription. Now, in order to post the images and share them, you're technically, I believe, supposed to have one. I haven't really looked too deep into their terms of service, but I believe it's 30 euros a month if you buy the non-commercial license, and then 100 euros a month for the commercial license if you want to sell the imagery or add value and sell it.
Use it, yeah. The other question I wanted to ask was, did you say that you discovered some new construction around Kerch? And if so, are there any implications you could share with us?
So the new construction that we found was this, if you look in that thread on the third tweet, it'll be the one after Special Hirson Kat's video. And it is the left image. If you pull it up, it says possible Russian air defense HQ garrison near Kerch, Crimea, Ukraine. And that we had seen on Sentinel-2 data, but this was the first high-res image I had seen of it, and it's quite the sight. There is it almost screams to be some kind of a HQ element or even a regimental level command element because of the amount of defenses. First of all, I mean, they have 2 lines of defenses, trenches, and they've also got everything under camo nets. And there's also the one thing that gives it away is there's a suspected Big Bird radar there. And those radars tend to be more at the, I want to make sure I get the nomenclature right because I don't exactly know it on the Russian side, but they tend to be more at the command level and more in the broader level. They're a big early warning radar that searches the entire area for incoming tracks, and versus some of the more directional and missile guidance radars. So that's what we had suspected there.
Thanks.
John, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. Just two things to add on to what Radio was saying. So in terms of the kind of GON aspect of locating these sites, specifically in regards to SAM sites, the United States, specifically, we have SBIRS, which is our infrared-based reconnaissance satellites that are in geostationary orbit. They have sufficient resolution to detect and track, or detect tactical ballistic missiles launches, and then track the missiles themselves in flight, I believe, with sufficient fidelity to pass targeting data to anti-ballistic missile systems. So whenever a Russian SAM site fires, SBIRS will see it immediately, and we'll be able to locate it with pretty exacting precision.
John, you remember when I made fun of it? My bad. I thought you were done.
Oh, no, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, do you remember when I called the Russian EKS the dollar store version of SBIRS?
Yeah, I mean, EKS can, if the goal is to detect US ICBM and SLBM launches, EKS can probably do that okay. I don't have much faith in its ability to detect a tactical ballistic missile launch or something of that similar size, or, general heat output. The other thing I was going to add was in regards to Big Bird, that's specifically that radar is the regimental radar. So in terms of the basic organizational structure of both S300P and S400, you will typically have a battery of 8 launchers, and then 4 of those batteries form a regiment. So Big Bird is the regimental search radar. So in principle, at full strength, every group of 4 batteries should have a single Big Bird that they're all linked to.
Okay. Well, I'll just reiterate what Radio and Nuke said, which is that he put in a ton of work on this, but as he mentioned, he worked with John on some of the missile tech, worked with a dog with no name on identifying some of the Russian systems. He got the heads up from Psi Intel on the location. I and others, worked on geolocation and translation and so on. Ultimately, he found the geolocation of that one video just by saying, hey, has anybody seen this? And then, somebody who's new to it had found the location. So that's both an example of, if you have a question, it never hurts to just ask. And if you're new to it, you can still find things. So all of those are important. And if you want to start working on stuff like this, let us know, because we have a little crowd who is floating around who, gets together to do these kind of work. Do you have a couple, I'm just curious, Radio and Nukes, do you have a couple more investigations in the fire? Irons in the fire?
Yeah. So right now, my main focus and a few others is to look at this, find the right window here, but basically to build out an order of battle of the air defense assets there in the Kerch area. And it looks to me like our preliminary work that this was the 18th Guards Anti-Aircraft Missile Regiment, which is based in Sevastopol and Fedosia, if I'm going to say that right, which is under the 3rd Radio Engineering Regiment. So we're trying to find all of the sites associated with this group and catalog them all in the open source.
Well, very cool. So if you want a hand with any of that, let us know. And hopefully you'll come back and tell us once you have some results on that. So thanks again. Okay.
Thank you.
And so our last presenter for, sort of community work that's been done is Cameron. And you'll see the first item in the nest now is his most recent thread. I think this is now the second, if I'm not mistaken, in what's looks like it's going to be a fairly, significant series on artillery production. The first was on the actual technical means of production. And this is starting to build a bit of a record for production rates. Cameron had put out a call last week, for example, for additional information on Turkish production that we reiterated here on our space. So it sounds like he has a couple more projects he's working on. But Cameron, thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Michael. I appreciate the visibility for my work. It's kind of just a hobby of mine, and it's ended up gaining a lot of attention. So I just thank you all for your support. And I'm here to answer any questions and also present this for those who haven't seen it yet.
Great. I know you were chatting a little bit with Exit. So Exit, did you want to run through a couple of questions for him?
Totally. We're chatting about the whole thread. So I guess first one, really obvious one. How long does it take to ramp up ammo production, and how do you do that?
So the ramp-up timeline really depends on the company and the source. It also depends on when they've started. So we saw some countries last year start issuing ramp-up rates. So like the United States has already been in active ramp-up for about a year now. When we're looking at some of the European countries, they have plans to ramp up, but some of them have not even issued the contracts to actually provide the money to ramp up yet. So manufacturers are starting to ramp up on their own. Although the issue is that manufacturers are not willing to put so much capital into ramping up production until they know they have the orders secured. So it's really been holding that back. There was also a lot of discussion within the EU based on where they could buy shells from. The EU did a joint procurement fund. I believe they were planning to do 2 billion euros at some point. The first track of that was to buy 1 million shells from people's stockpiles. The second one was for production. I know France in particular held the production agreement up because France was saying that all the ammo that would get paid for from the EU fund had to come from within Europe. And they ended up reaching a compromise where parts of the shells can be made abroad, but parts of the shells also have to come from within Europe or final production to be able to be eligible for that EU funding. So we're looking at about 2025 for most of this ramp-up production to come online, but some of it will not be done until 2028. So you've seen a lot of contracts get issued to private vendors in the case of the U.S., for example, because some of the government facilities that are being upgraded will take a bit. So to add extra capacity in the meantime, we've outsourced it to companies that we normally would not give contracts to because we already have the facilities.
So Exit, I know you have 2 or 3 more questions. Why don't you just run through them and then we'll take hands from the audience.
Yeah, I will do that. Thank you. So then how much production capacity have you identified specifically with your research? And you said it'll be available in 2025, but is there any ability for them to ramp up faster than that?
So in the actual production terms, in theory, they could ramp up faster, but I doubt they're going to. If this was the United States at war and there was a severe shell shortage, you'd start seeing a lot of the requirements for environmental review, OSHA protections, building inspections going out the window. And while the U.S. is trying to do this quickly, they haven't necessarily cut all the red tape in front of it. They are doing it quicker than most countries, though, so we are going to hit 90,000 shells a month by 2025 is the most recent plan. There was a plan before that to reach 40,000 shells a month by 2025 and 85,000 by 2028 that also still gets referenced, which can be confusing. But the U.S. realized that would be very inadequate and nowhere meet the needs of what we're going to have to do to replace the stockpile and provide aid to Ukraine. Part of what took so long is a lot of countries didn't realize this war was going to go on for quite a long time, so they didn't look at it with the same urgency that they should have. So the U.S. was relatively quick, but it could have been quicker. In terms of overall production, I've identified the U.S. production, which is going to be 1,080,000 rounds a year in 2025. And they plan to run it at that rate for quite a bit to replenish the stockpile as well. There's also been 6 companies in Europe that I've looked into and got hard figures on. Now I have 7 or 8 hard figures. So you have a lot of these concerns. I'll start going through them specifically. Hopefully this doesn't get too lengthy. But in the U.S., it's all one governmental effort. In Europe, it's a bunch of different companies. So we have, for example, Rheinmetall is probably the most interesting example. So they're producing about 100,000 rounds a year right now. But the interesting thing is they just bought Spanish ammo giant Expal, who may have the largest capacity in all of Europe. And then they also, in 2022, just opened a plant in Australia that's a joint venture between Rheinmetall and NIOA, as well as Rheinmetall Denel in South Africa, which surprisingly is able to send shells to Europe. So looking at this, Rheinmetall plans to get to 600,000 shells next year, and this is just one single German company. They're doing it through multiple plants and facilities, but their CEO, Armand Papager, has made comments to that effect a lot. And one time he even referenced that in the future they may even be able to get it up to 700,000 rounds a year. But we're probably looking at not next year for that 700,000 rounds figure, but next year they will do 600,000. We've also seen some existing capacity. For example, Saab goes under the radar a lot. So Johansson's their CEO, and he talked about how the EU's aim to produce 1 million a year was realistic, because that they're able to produce 400,000 shells a year by early 2025. And this is a company that a lot of people don't even think of when they're talking about artillery shell manufacturing. They don't get mentioned as much as a lot of the others, but they have one of the largest capacities in Europe. This interview was extremely hard to find. Only a few sites picked it up. When Rheinmetall's CEO speaks, he specifically mentions a lot of stuff with Ukraine that gets it brought up into the headlines and at larger press conferences. Then BAE Systems issued a contract last week, I guess it was this week actually, to increase production by 8 times. Their current production is likely about 30 to 40,000 a year. So they're estimated to ramp up to about 250 to 300,000 a year out of the UK. An interesting one that was really hard to find was the Polish concern PGZ, and which owns Desimet. So at Defense 24 Day, which was kind of this little defense media day they had, they revealed that they could make 40,000 shells annually currently, and it's likely about 50,000 now, but they will ramp up to 200,000 shells per year, and they have contracts to run at that rate until at least 2029. One of the last producers I really found was Nammo, which is a Scandinavian ammo maker. They're a lot smaller than I had hoped. They get a lot of media headlines because they make some really fancy shells, and they were apparently already running at full capacity before the war, which is why they're taking so long to ramp up. So they're going to ramp up to 200,000 155 millimeter shells a year by 2028. Then there's also the French Nexter, which is not included in my thread. I'm now able to confirm they're planning to hit at least 100,000 shells a year by 2025, or within 2 years of the original announcement. A lot of these don't really get picked up by English language sites or English language news. The German ones tend to, but everybody else not so much. So it really becomes hard to find. And then, of course, we've known about this. Probably one of the first companies to announce ramp-ups was CSG, Czechoslovak Group, which owns MSM, which is an artillery shell producer in Slovakia. I've also identified from an interview with Ukraine's defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, he said that if all the 152 millimeter factories in Europe, which is the Soviet caliber ammo, ran at full tilt, that would equal 600,000 rounds a year. So that's another potential source. So with 155 alone, we're looking at 2.5 million verifiable, but we also have other allies producing it. So the overall production picture will likely reach about 4 to 5 million, but not all of that will go to Ukraine. Some of it will go into country stockpiles. Some countries may be unwilling to sell, and then we may pick up another million or two between different Soviet calibers, as well as 120 millimeter mortars. So the overall artillery numbers are there. It's just about the political will to get them to Ukraine. Hopefully that wasn't long. I thought I'd have that more well organized, but I ended up jumping a little.
No worries. I only have one last question. Well, it's kind of a two-parter. Do we have enough supply for Ukraine if there's the political will to do that? And if not, how can we deal with that in between now and 2025? And also, obviously, you don't work alone doing this. Other people help you out with this. Is there specific places where you would like more sources, or is there specific people that you work with really closely to do this?
So, in terms of people, I've worked a little bit with Dr. Paul. He's great at going through contracts with me, and we'll start throwing around ideas and press releases. He's a great source. I've talked a little bit about this with John Ridge and OPSEC, as well as a few people who work in production, just in terms of the difficulty of scaling things like metal parts. So everybody here has been a great source, and there's some people that have tagged me or sent me articles as well, especially after that tweet I had the other day, got about 1 million views. Some people who translated it from other languages started sending me stuff in French and started sending me stuff in Chinese and all these other languages, and some of it ended up being relevant. So the more attention I have on the subject, generally the more I'm starting to learn about it, because there's some releases that went under my radar, and I thought I did a deep dig. And in the meantime, the U.S. is drawing from its war reserve stockpile. It's probably about 4 to 5 million shells in there, excluding cluster munitions. We had 600,000 shells backfilled into the stockpile from South Korean production. 100,000 of them were sold to us, and 500,000 of them were loaned to us on some weird conditional basis. That was more so to make sure that the U.S. was the end user, so that we didn't give them to other countries by accident or on purpose. South Korea was pretty concerned about that. So we have that stockpile we're drawing on. The only issue is we've already run it down 2 million shells. We've added maybe 1 million back to it if we've been lucky. So we start to run into requirements for certain conflicts, and the DoD sets a standard to have enough ammo for 2.5 high-intensity conflicts. And if we draw the stock any lower, we will not have that. But it doesn't mean that we don't have millions of rounds left. So a lot of media reports that are saying the United States is out of ammo are wrong, but we're going to have to make some tough choices going forward, which is why political will is so important. Are we going to pressure allies to send? Are we willing to pay way more than shells are worth? Are we able to pressure countries to send their production to Ukraine, even if it means giving them extra U.S. security guarantees or preferential treatment in other spaces? South Korea is probably the world's largest producer of 1.5 millimeter ammunition. So if they actually open the spigot to Ukraine, or if we can get them to somehow rely on their huge industrial base more than just selling shells to us, that may help a lot. So that's what I mean by political will. The factories are there, the production's there, at least it will be there. Ukraine could always fire more than we can give it, but we will be able to supply the current rate and even increase their rate of fire. Well, it looks like the Russian rate of fire has been dropping, and Russia may also face some supply constraints in the future because it's run through the majority of its stockpile. But like we do, it still has a lot of stockpile, and it started from a higher level than the U.S. stockpile. I also wanted to identify there's a few 100,000 rounds in Bulgaria that may be sold to Ukraine. And I'm sorry if I went on a little bit or rambled. I've been pretty tired today, so it wasn't exactly my sharpest moment on here. So hopefully I covered everything in an interesting way.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, Cameron. I know you've been wanting to look at it for a while. I'm glad you're into your series. I also think what you described is something we've heard from several other folks. It's been my experience. Andrew Perpetua has spoken to it as well. I'm sure Radio and Nukes is seeing it to a degree, that once you start putting out good work, people will reach out to you with tips or offers of help, and it can make things go way faster. So we'll run through hands to do questions. I think it was Democracy Watch first, and then I think it was John. Go ahead, Democracy.
Yeah. First, as a direct follow-up to this, Aaron could probably provide a link to last night's discussion. It was a good introduction to this. They would mention some aspects involving Turkey, some of the things you covered, some things about Japan, a little more detail there, and South Korea. Ditto on that. Also, Egypt is involved. It was a real good introductory introduction to this. I raised a question in, like I say, Aaron who's listening, he can probably provide a link to last night's space. It's a good start. Cameron, really good. I'm impressed. I used to be a QA auditor at National Semiconductor back in the 70s, so I can appreciate this.
Thanks, Dean. John, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, which John? My bad.
Sorry, I thought it was, we'll go with John Ridge, then John Larrier. Sorry about that.
No worries. So thank you, Michael. So two questions for you, Cameron. The first is, do you have a good sense of what 105 production looks like, 105 millimeter at this point?
105 millimeter production is smaller than 155 millimeter. Obviously, with the decreased range and the decreased area of effect when you're firing them, not only is it more risky to fire them, they don't do as much in terms of outranging other artillery. There still is active U.S. production of these rounds. I haven't seen as much pertaining to their ramp up, but between the U.S. and the other NATO countries, I would say there's at least capacity for a few 100,000 of them, if I could make an educated guess. But it's not going to be quite as close as it is to 155 millimeter production. Countries like South Korea and some of our other allies also produce 105 that are not necessarily in NATO, so those may also be potential sources of supply, but I'm not as familiar with those numbers.
Thanks. And then the second question is regarding the production ramp up itself. I saw it was pretty widely reported, at least as of several months ago, that at least at the time, the bottleneck then for the U.S. was the availability of manufacturing equipment and machine tooling. Is that the case for Europe as well? And is that still the case for the U.S.? Is that still our current bottleneck as far as you're aware?
Well, so that's kind of a two-sided answer. There's stuff that's bottlenecking us today, and there is stuff that will bottleneck us as we ramp up. So, for example, our bottleneck today may not be the same as our bottleneck 12 months from now, because some things take longer to add capacity to than others. So in terms of what's taking the longest to ramp up and why we've seen contracts issued to upgrade this first, metal parts is going to be the thing that constrains it most. And it's going to be the thing that's going to take the longest to ramp up. So we saw like the United States even gave I think a $68 million contract or $101 million contract to a company in Canada to make metal parts for 155 millimeter shells. It's kind of irregular to see the United States go outside of its own borders to fund another facility, but it's also adding a metal parts plant in Texas, and there's 2 to 4 more facilities that might get added, but the Army hasn't necessarily confirmed those contracts yet. The current issue we are seeing is explosive filler material, and that's part of why we are partnering with Japan to buy some explosive material from them. We're also doing something called going to private plants. So the current ammo facilities that we've been producing from for the last 20, 30 years, government-owned, contractor-operated facilities. They're called GOCO. They're operated by private companies but owned by the U.S. government. What we've done is we've gone out to private facilities that are not U.S. government-owned, and they are now getting contracts to make these. General Dynamics has its own plant, for example. I could name a few others, but it's going to take a bit. But yes, machinery is a big part of it, and that's more on the metal parts side. But there's different constraints as we go along. So that's why you're seeing metal parts contracts get issued first.
Well, thanks for that. We'll go to John Larrier and then to Gurney. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for the mix-up before. It's great to have Cameron up here to provide some insight. First and foremost, I would thanks for talking about GOCOs, Cameron, because it's one of my favorite acronyms in the force. My question would be, essentially, in what ways you kind of were touching on South Korea and Japan as well, with all the different Pacific, and Asia Pacific partnerships we have out there and different initiatives and frameworks. In what ways could we possibly provide more interoperability with, from a supply chain standpoint, and also just from a maybe simply to boil it down, working together standpoint between like NATO entities and also Western European entities and the different frameworks like AUKUS or the Quad to maybe streamline some of this stuff that we have going on. I know you touched on like the idea of the political will. Do you have any other potentialities or opinions that may possibly streamline this process, make it either faster or better at implementing it?
Well, the number one, okay, Mr. Allies and Partners there, I see what you did. But yeah, basically, more money is always going to equal more results to a degree. You get diminishing return, but the more funding you add, you kind of get countries to be more willing to sell to you. If you're offering a country to make 5% on their artillery shells and they say, hey, no, we need these, that's going to be less likely to transfer. But if you're offering 2 or 3 times what they paid for those shells, they're going to say, you know what, we can go produce new shells and wait, and now we can buy 3 times as many shells, or we can fund this other project. So money is one of the things that's really involved with it. In terms of streamlining it between willing allies, there's not a single joint framework. So these companies are going to have to partner with other companies on their own to kind of find excess capacity. So there might be some stuff behind the scenes going on where government's helping identify this capacity. But for example, one company might make a lot of extra shell bodies and another company might make a lot of extra fuses, and they kind of need to seek each other out and mesh their capacity. It'd be nice to see a centralized effort in terms of like funding and facilitating company partnerships. So, if the US, South Korea, Japan, and all the rest of NATO were to create a single fund to kind of coordinate this with maybe $5 to $10 billion, that would be great. The issue you run into is you get countries like Hungary, where if you use existing frameworks, you have these countries that are not so keen on giving ammunition to Ukraine, even though they're allies of ours technically, that end up holding up the frameworks. Or you have countries like France that tend to look out more so for their own interest and kind of do not like the U.S. being involved in a lot of their policy decisions because they are trying to establish some level of European independence in terms of the French.
So essentially, just a quick follow-up, what you're talking about is something maybe similar to like the NATO defense production program that they kind of have ongoing, but the weaknesses in that are also, as would be a weakness in the NATO defense production program, would be essentially countries kind of hamstringing the process, like Hungary and France has done. Thank you, man.
Okay. We'll go. So, Jacoby, you had your hand up just as co-host. Did you want to add something in?
Oh, John, your microphone was a little bit prickly. I don't know if you noticed it. It was a quick change, so I just wanted to bring that to your attention.
Yeah, if you have a, actually, sorry, John Ridge, you're okay. Was it Who made the last point? Was it John Ridge or John Larrier?
Sorry, it was John Larrier. Sorry.
Yeah. So John Larrier, if you need to comment again, you might want to cycle, and we'll bring you back up as speaker. Gurney, go ahead. Gurney may be having a problem with his mic. We'll go to exit and see if we can get him back in.
So Cameron, just to follow up to that, is there other funding options for financing for those companies that want to ramp up and be able to help Ukraine out? Like, it seems to me that if there was extra ammunition around that somebody could purchase, that might be a good thing. And so having outside funding and financing might be a useful thing.
Yeah, so we have seen actually a lot of that. The US was the first to do it. The UK has also been heavily involved in going and seeking out ammunition for Ukraine. They've done this throughout a lot of the Middle East and Africa. We were able to flip Egypt from potentially making grad rockets for Russia to actually making ammunition for Ukraine because we found out about some intelligence reports saying that they may be making ammunition for Russia. So it's kind of funny. We're able to flip that source. There's actually a lot of cases where both arms dealers that work for the United States and arms dealers that work for Russia are trying to buy up the same supply abroad from the countries that don't care who they're sending to. They just care about the highest bidder. So funny enough, we're competing with the Russians for some of the ammo that we're buying from abroad. Obviously not from every country. Most countries are not sending them ammo, but they have been able to buy up ammo from certain sources.
Did you want to follow up, Exit?
Just super quickly. So I guess my question was more, is there private financing available to these companies to ramp up before they have the sales that they're looking for?
It comes in different ways. The United States has issued some to companies abroad. We might be the only one that's done that, to my knowledge. A lot of it is, countries going out and saying, hey, if you produce more, we'll buy them. But these are not always long-term contracts when you're dealing with these other countries. So it's really hard to say, but there has been some cases of that. The information's not all that public. Like with Egypt, for example, we don't know how much they're going to produce or how much we ordered or what our deal with them is. We just know that there is a deal in place for them to produce 155 and 152. Same thing with Pakistan. We've bought ammunition, but it hasn't been public if one of the conditions is ramping up that production. But we have seen the U.S. go and invest in facilities in Canada and in Europe and elsewhere and give them grants to ramp up their production, even though the U.S. is not the end user and is not buying those shells. But I have not seen another comprehensive private framework to go do that. But if anybody has any insights to that, that'd be great.
Colby, go ahead.
Regarding Exit's question, private capital is going to be hesitant to invest in these companies for the same reason that the companies themselves are hesitant to invest in expanding their own production lines, because they're very concerned about their ROI. So they don't want to spend many millions of dollars on expanding facilities and acquiring new suppliers for all the subcomponents they need and hiring new labor if they're not certain that they're actually going to get contracts to put all those assets to work. So the contracts and the long-term contracts really have to come first before we see private capital, whether it's the companies themselves making investments with their own profits or just private capital more broadly from banks or other lenders that would be willing to invest capital. It's not going to happen unless the contracts are there first.
Well, thanks for that. I know Gurney did have a question. I think he had a mic issue. I don't know if he's back. We'll give him a couple of seconds to see if he is. that may be a no. In which case, if Gurney reconnects, we'll bring him up in a few minutes.
Also, Michael, I did want to ask you, I had notes prepared, but I actually left them somewhere. So in terms of like, do you think I've covered everything, and do you think it's been somewhat specific and good, or do you think there's things I should improve upon in that regard? Because I plan on doing more of these in the future, and I feel like I may have been a little bit disorganized, so I'm hoping it didn't seem like that too much on your end.
No, I appreciated your presentation, and I also appreciate that this thread on AMR production rates is part of a series, and you started with the basics of how are the shells manufactured and sort of an update on here's the information I have on production rates. And it's helpful to have it all in one spot. I also like that you had the screenshots. It's nice to, particularly if you can include links back to sources, like where the statements came from. And I'm excited to hear what you come up with next, particularly as you said that lots of people are now sending you info on some countries where the information may have been less accessible to you. So do you know specifically what your next thread will be about?
I did one just talking about how generally like Western production can outstrip Russian production, and pegging some estimates based on I used some screenshots from Estonian intelligence, the Jamestown Foundation, and also Russian state-run media talking about like Russian production. And I was explaining how a lot of their production is actually shells being remanufactured. So it's shells that they already count as a portion of their inventory, but they've gotten so old where these then need to be refurbished before they're safe to fire. And then I was talking about Russia's plan to ramp up their shell production as well. Not as much in terms of sourcing to be able to be done on that, and there's not nearly as many sources on it. And then when there are sources, I don't necessarily trust Russian sources, but I had to go and use some of them anyways, because these specific numbers are not really mentioned elsewhere.
Well, we'll look forward to that ongoing series that you'll work on. And if anybody listening has insight into any of those points Cameron referred to, including Russian sources, please do reach out to him. I see we have a couple more hands up, so we'll go through last questions for Cameron, then we'll move into updates. Jacoby, please go ahead.
Thanks, Michael. I just wanted to say, Cameron, I was sitting in your last space, or first space, I guess, maybe on this topic at the end of June. And I don't think you recorded it, but I imagine that you'll be doing future spaces on this in relation to your threads, or coming back to get into it with us in this space too, whichever works better for you. But or maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, if that space that you had was actually recorded.
A lot of the times I don't end up recording spaces just because, you don't want to say something wrong or make a mistake while speaking and then have a bunch of people go, oh, well, it's actually this. So I like to make sure I kind of vet the information I'm giving out. And sometimes in spaces, I'll shoot off ideas. So sometimes I try not to record, but if that's something you guys think you'd re-listen to, I could definitely start recording in the future. And I'll probably have some of my own spaces with some people talking about the technicalities, just because it's something I find very interesting. A lot of the information might end up being repeated. But if that is something you guys are interested in, I probably will host a space sometime within the next week. And whenever I have updates, I'll try and come and give them to you guys, whether that's here, the Bormo report, or whether that's the Mira report, or a lot of the other ones. I try and, spread it around, and it helps me make contact with some people who are interested in similar subjects. So even if the information gets repeated, I get to expand my audience, and I get to meet some really cool people along the way.
Well, that'll be exciting. I'll definitely look for your spaces. We'll go to Gurney for a last question.
Hey, thanks. Sorry about those issues earlier with the audio. Request to Cameron and maybe anyone else who's out there listening. And I know this is a big lift here, but sort of similar in the way that Oryx has been methodically, and it's not just one person, right? It's many people have been tracking some of the visual losses. I know the artillery is a huge lift to do any angle of it. But I'd be really interested to sort of, and again, whether or not any of us here are entitled to it or not, but to see something like a spreadsheet or a presentation, not just on production and ambitions and current levels, which is already hard enough to do, thanks to Cameron and just getting some of those sources. But I'd like to see both coincide, both tracking past consumption, and again, whether it's estimates, whether it's transfers, but to see both current production and not necessarily future production, but to see sort of a spreadsheet, whether there's a deficit between them in terms of transfers, right, to give a bigger picture. And I know that's asking for quite a bit, and it might take a lot of time, but to aggregate and put whatever it is we think we know in the open source community about past consumption, past average levels, et cetera, if that can even be done, about what Ukraine has been using, and past transfers, just to sort of understand the status quo of what has happened, and to add to that complement of where the production wants to go. I know it's big, but that's where I'd like to, I put it out there to Cameron and whomever, if they've got, a couple of years of time on their hands to do it. Not a joke.
Yeah, so I do actually have some spreadsheets about production and usage. I just will let you know they're incomplete, and the ones I'll be willing to publish, because I know the data is good, are going to be really incomplete, just because not everybody's going to publish those numbers. But it can give you an idea of certain companies and countries and what they've been producing and sending, and how much they've sent so far, also how much they're making now and how much they say they will be making in a few years. So I can definitely take some of those Excel sheets and put them in a Google Doc and start publishing those, but I do want to make sure I publish the ones that I know are good information, because I would really hate to put out bad information out there or kind of tarnish a reputation, because I do try and do a lot of research before I necessarily make threads like that, which is why I included so many screenshots. And there's some of them where you might have somebody on Twitter saying a production rate's here or usage rate's here, and I might write that down for reference, but it's not good enough for me to claim that the production rate is this, unless it's someone like Oryx that I trust. But I'll definitely get that, Gurney, and I'll tag you in that post if I remember to do so.
Without being overly skeptical about the ability to do that, as Gurney describes, in terms of a comprehensive summary of production and usage rates, I still think that there's value in aggregating the claims or the partial information that we do have, because it can at least put constraints around the issue. But I do imagine it will be hard to the, touching on impossible to get accurate estimates of use rates, because whenever I hear them, it's things like, oh, the Russians are firing 60,000 a day, but then somebody else will say they're firing 40,000 a day, and they're not very specific about the time period of that use rate. And so I suspect that your error margins will be huge, but you could still aggregate the claims together, which might be interesting on its own. And Cameron, one other point that came up when I was reading your thread, I saw one person say something in reply along the lines of, there are likely to be delays over these time schedules. How optimistic are these schedules? How much of it is contingent on additional funding, whether it's from the government or through contracts or direct investment? So maybe putting any knowledge you have of conditions. I know you talk about the time horizon, but if you can find any constraints, like the risk, the follow through may be delayed, that would probably increase people's confidence in the reports. But with that, I think that's it for the questions for Cameron. So once again, thanks very much. And I encourage everybody to check out Cameron's reports and give him a follow so that when he comes out with his next updates, you'll all see them. Okay, I'll move on to Actually, before I move on to updates, since we have Gurney up, Gurney, I think you may have had one question for John. Oh, John Ridge is gone. Okay. So sorry, he's moved down to listener. If he happens to come up, then Gurney will let you get your question in a bit. Here he comes. So I think we have you both here. Gurney, did you want to put your question to John?
Yeah, so this is just supposition, but we were talking earlier. There was a question there. I don't remember the type of munition or rocket type, but it was the question was asked: could it be North Korea? How did something from North Korea get to Ukraine? And it just reminded me of a Caliber Obscura post and some references. I'm not sure the year. I just sent it there. I sent it to Jacoby. There was, I'm sure there's many others that may not have been announced, but there was a very public seizure of an Iranian ship that had arms components on it. And I do believe we've seen some of those small arms and other munitions show up in Ukraine. So I just wanted to ask if it was plausible or even possible or even linked that some of those North Korean rockets could have been from an Iranian ship seizure and then transferred to Iran. But that was, I know there's a lot of supposition in there, but there was a pretty good post from Caliber Obscura showing, a deck load of a cargo ship just stacked to the gills, mostly small arms, but there's definitely rockets in other large containers that you can't tell what's inside the circular containers. And that obviously is not whatever is in the cargo hold down below. But I wanted to ask John if that was possible.
So in principle, perhaps the thing to consider with the Iranian seizures is that yes, the decent amount of seized kit has been transferred to Ukraine, but a lot of the larger Iranian stuff has not come from seizures. It's been bought directly from Iran or Iranian manufacturers, or somehow sourced directly from Iran. So I guess it's possible, but I would say that there are much more plausible pathways that it could have gotten to Ukraine besides that. I'd say probably the most plausible is it was a re-export to from a third-party country, or after that it was a seizure of a North Korean arms vessel, probably in the 80s or 90s, or probably the 90s. I'd have to guess, as Colby said.
Gurney, does that answer your questions? Hopefully it does. I know Gurney had some mic problems, so I'm glad that we managed to get his question connected to John. So thanks for that back and forth, guys. At this point, I'm going to move into updates from the agenda. We have about an hour, so a whole lot happened this week. We may not get through very much of it today. In that case, a lot of our content from today will probably be moved to our conversation on Sunday. We plan these spaces only, maybe 2 spaces in advance, because so much of it is based on breaking news. On Sunday, we will be chatting about the Black Sea Grain Initiative, because it's due to expire on the 17th, which is the Monday, and either we'll be at a nail biter or we'll have just had announcements made on the 16th. And then, since we'll be on that theme, we'll also be chatting a lot more in depth about Turkey, both their moves with regard to approving or toward approving Sweden's accession to NATO, and just sort of their Western, perceived Western movement with the release of the Azovstal, officers and the like. So we're hoping to have some guests on who can speak to some naval issues and or some Turkish issues. But that's by way of a bit of a teaser. So thanks to all the people who presented. I'm glad we can have a space where it was such a discussion of community, projects. And it's great to see everybody coming together like that. So I hope that we'll have lots more like this. Since this was part of the presentation of good examples, there was one that I forgot that's a follow-up on some things that we discussed on Sunday, when it had been identified by H.I. Sutton and others that Russia has begun using these camouflage paint jobs on several of their ships. I think it's now up to 7 or 8 that it's been detected on. And I just wanted to give you guys an update on that. So it's now the third item back in the nest. But it was noted that there's this company called SATIM Monitoring, who, through a combination of satellite imagery and the algorithms that they run, can still detect I believe, the specific models of ships, despite the use of these new camouflage paint systems. And so, in response to Mr. Sutton's post, SATIM Monitoring, the satellite company, responded and said, thanks very much for the coverage. And then we reached out just to say, hey, if you'd ever like to discuss the way your technology works in a space, we'd be happy to have you. And they seemed open to that idea. So, perhaps in the next couple of sessions, we can have them in to discuss the tech that they're working on. So I'm going to begin the updates with a little bit on the offensives. I'm going to put or the Ukrainian offensive, I should say. I'm going to put some material up in the nest. While I do that, if you have a look, the second item back in the nest is the post that I put up with a collection of some of the better mapping efforts. And the reason that I do that is because there are lots of folks who cover the developments on the front line in great detail. We don't try to break that kind of information because it's usually too fresh to be relevant if you only hold spaces as we do twice a week. But I'd encourage you to check out those maps. It's good to look at a variety of sources because sometimes they'll differ a little bit. And in particular, if you want a walkthrough of one of those maps, I'll remind you that a friend of ours, Andrew Perpetua, holds talks on YouTube, streaming live, where he screen shares his map and he can sort of walk through the changes to it. And he does that on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern time, and I believe Fridays at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And I know that several of our friends will join him, Exit, Constantine, and some others from time to time. So go check out his work if you'd like to see the latest along the front lines. I will just highlight those locations where there seemed to have been notable movement. And so the first item in the nest is a tweet from OSINT Technical, and he is working off a geolocation from a newer account, Mocklison. You'll see him quote tweeting him, but I want to give credit to the original geolocator. But OSINT Technical then added some additional detail about the tactical implications of the fact that around Robotyne, the Ukrainians appear to have captured the significant portions of that first line of Russian trenches, which is a significant development on its own. And it's great to see that that's fairly well evidenced. So good progress on that portion of the offensive. The second item in the nest talks about progress around Bakhmut. And so I think she may be the Ukrainian Deputy Minister of Defense, Hannah Malyar, on her Telegram channel, made the announcement that the Ukrainians have most of Bakhmut within fire control, having seized the heights around the city. And you'll see what I posted as the second item in the nest is Defmon's interpretation on top of that, where he notes that he doesn't think it's fire control to the level where they have problems supplying the forces inside Bakhmut, but that there may be supply issues in the surrounding villages, and that there is fire control over much of the city, even if it doesn't cover all of the supply lines. So again, good progress there. The third item I've put up in the nest, it refers to rumors of a Russian push in the east around the city of Torskoye, and this account that I've put up, Estraya, is newer to me, is being retweeted a fair bit, but I don't have a long history of tracking the account's reliability, but it's one that was posting supposed updates of the front line there, suggesting that even after a couple of days of apparent Russian attacks in that area, that there was not a lot of progress on the ground. But I wanted to note the claims that the Russians were actually trying to push a little bit in the east. It's unclear to me how significant that is. So if anybody has any more up-to-date information on that aspect of the fighting, please feel free to come up and add in comments. A few other updates I'm just adding now on impacts from the offensive that aren't with regard to territorial control. The first of which is with regard to discussion of artillery losses. And this is coming from a Russian mill blogging source. And I think it's in connection with the resignation of a Russian, I believe he was a major general, but commander, Popov. And so we'll discuss the political implications of Popov's removal from command in a moment. But included in his complaints were that Russia is now losing howitzers and MLRS at a ratio of 1 to 4 against the Ukrainians. And I have seen, that coincides with the rough numbers that are being reported by people like Oryx and Warspotting. And it's interesting when Gurney came up to ask Cameron about, I may have put the wrong post in the nest. Sorry, I'm just correcting that. When Gurney came up to ask Cameron about tracking the artillery use, for a moment I thought he was going to ask about tracking the number of artillery tubes in the country, because of course the amount of ammunition you have is only one part of the the formula, and that how many guns you have to fire it is important as well. So I thought it was relevant that this Russian source is saying that they are losing artillery pieces at a rate of 4 times losses of Ukrainian artillery pieces. The second item in the nest is a tweet from Tataragami, who I believe is a Ukrainian. I'm not sure if he's a reserve officer or territorial defense, but puts up some thoughtful tactical updates from time to time. He recently came across a manual, apparently a Russian manual, that includes discussions of their strategies for the use of mines. And so this tweet in the nest goes through some of the ways that the Russians are deploying mines. And in a moment or two, we'll get into some of the disorder, the recent disruptions in Russian command. And the reason I bring that up is I think it may have been Dara Massacott or one of those analysts like her, who said that, even if there is disorder in the Russian command, or there are, concerns about provisions for the Russian troops on the front line, neither of those things affect the number of mines that are laying out there in the fields. And so, given we have had lots of reports that mines are one of the more significant challenges that the Ukrainians face, it's interesting to see Tataragami's passing along of apparent Russian strategy on those fronts. The third item in the nest is a comment that was made by a Ukrainian soldier who was off for Western training. It's not clear. They say the training was in Germany. It's not clear which allies were training them. But they made several notes, including the fact that Western troops don't rely on electronic devices at all, that the Ukrainians now have lots of tablets. They don't rely on paper documents. And that in particular, they talk about the use of the Kropiva software, which is sort of a battle management or battle planning software, and also the heavy use of Ukrainian drones, and that the Western trainers are not using drones much at all, at least in their training. And so I saw a couple of analysts say that, it's I'm sure that they appreciate the Western training, that it's helpful to lots of them, but that in some ways it's not reflective of the fight that is going on. And I've seen some analysts suggest that in a couple of months or years, it's likely that many of the experienced Ukrainian fighters will come back and be trainers for Western forces on how to incorporate some of the tactics that they're developing, particularly some of the electric, information management systems and drone use. A couple of hands up. I'll go to Jacoby as co-host and then to exit.
Yeah, I was speaking to somebody about this series of threads earlier today, and the thought was raised that, he was making a point of pointing out that the trainers were not necessarily meeting the Ukrainian trainees where they were at, and that was very problematic given that the time constraints and the resource constraints that are on Ukrainians and in the middle of an invasion, and that a lot of these trainees seemed to not necessarily be operating with considerable urgency, at least from the vantage point of the writer. And that's pretty concerning and should be addressed sooner rather than later.
Interesting observations. Which is not to downplay the value of the Western training, and that it's probably helpful in many, many ways, particularly because Ukraine had so many forces to train at the same time. But it is interesting to hear these stories, even though they are anecdotal. Go ahead, exit.
Konstantin can correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, but my understanding was that he mentioned that they were U.S. trainers, and that he specifically mentioned the fact that they were all Ukrainian troops that had previous combat experience, and that the U.S. trainers didn't actually know that coming into the plan, and so their plan for training didn't take that into account. And when they did let them know that was the case, the trainers had said that they would kind of change things, but it didn't seem like maybe that it happened in the same way they expected it to. But I'm sure Konstantin will correct me if I'm incorrect there. Go ahead, Konstantin.
Hello. I joined and I was disconnected, and then again was disconnected again. So I was talking about the post of the Ukrainian recon officer or service member who was training in Germany and who made a thread about it recently. I take that as a thumbs up as a yes. So yeah, you're mostly right. I just wanted to add a couple of sentences. You got to take all those things like this with a bit of grain of salt. Also, because I've seen a lot of Western people, like there are two camps. Some of people interpreted, our training is complete garbage and we don't know what we're doing, or others saying, no, the Ukrainians don't understand what's happening. But the reality is it's not anywhere in between. It's just we have to interpret right what he said, like his words. It's an experience. We have to remember it's an experience of a specific person who has his thoughts on everything, and there is a bureaucratic procedures that that's basically how the training is happening. There is bureaucracy tied to it, and the bureaucracy kicks in, and changing the training program is not something that can be done on the fly. So actually his feedback or what he said is, I hope it's going to be heard, and there's going to be added some flexibility to what's going on. And yeah, you're right. He was talking about the fact that the Rangers, it was Rangers who were trained. They have that. They gotta learn everything from the basics. They gotta learn from the maps, from like paper maps. And if you know how to use a paper map, if you know how to do those things, trust me, learning how to use the tablet is gonna be with the map. It's gonna be really easy for you. Yeah, my mic isn't great on this call. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sitting on the street and I'm gonna shut up for this. Thank you. But yeah, you're totally right, like this, and there is not much taken in. Just keep those things in mind that person who was doing it, it's not like an evaluation. It's more like an experience of one person, and his description of it is actually generally really positive. And he says that they learned a lot, but there were of course things that he considers are not the best.
Okay, well, that's interesting that his overall evaluation was more positive. Perhaps the criticism, the points of criticism are being highlighted a bit for dramatic effect. But I appreciate that, Konstantin. Go ahead, Jacoby.
Yeah, and to Konstantin's point, much appreciated, is if you read much of the writer's commentary, he peppers through it a fair bit of humor and his observations, I would say, are certainly anecdotal and personal to his situation, but he doesn't he is generally positive. I would definitely agree with Konstantin there, but it's definitely still worth talking about. I think the observations that he's making, as Exit pointed out, that it seems as though the training was aimed in one direction and they hadn't pivoted to accommodate soldiers who had seen combat before, who had a higher level of training, that sort of thing. But to take all of his writing in full and not just the criticism.
That makes sense to me. So just continuing. The last item on sort of an overview of the offensive that I thought was interesting. It's the first item in the nest. It's from the account. They have a YouTube channel called Good Times, Bad Times. I've highlighted some of their videos in the past. They'll occasionally work with Konrad Muzyka, taking his analysis and then animating it, onto a map. And in this case, it's not Konrad's analysis, it's somebody else's, but it was an interesting conversation about the fragility of Russian logistics in Zaporizhia. And so if you'd like sort of a quick overview with some graphics, do check that video out. The next topic I wanted to discuss was some of the recent turnover in Russian command. And that includes people being removed, senior officers being killed and the like. So starting with the second item back in the nest, this is a thread from Dara Massicott, who's at the RAND Institute, RAND Institute, I think. And she runs through several of the ways in which Shoigu and Gerasimov have been limiting the roles of their subordinates and sort of taking retribution if they do things like show particular aptitude on the battlefield. If they're gaining too much prominence, they seem to take an effort to minimize them. Or as this general did, Popov, he apparently wrote a complaint about a lack of rotation of Russian troops and about the imbalance in quality of artillery coverage, talking about failures in Russian counter artillery fire. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the difference in lost rates of Russian artillery pieces versus Ukrainian. And as a result of that complaint, he was accused, I believe, by Gerasimov directly, or those are the reports, of attempting to blackmail senior officers. And so he's been removed from command, following which he recorded a statement that he put out that included his complaints, which is why we know more details about them. But, you know, the treatment of Surovikin and Popov and others, you know, when they are repeating problems with the Russian forces that are plain for everyone to see, is to minimize them or reduce their role. Whereas others who appear to have been more incompetent, like Lapin and others, have simply been moved to different roles only to then be, you know, given sort of ceremonial roles. Like Lapin, after being apparently moved to Syria, then appeared leading forces, or in video, leading forces trying to repel the Russian rebels from Belgorod. So, you know, it's not promoting quality of leadership. And so Darius' thread lays all that out. The third item back in the nest is to start at the top. So if Dara gave an overview, one figure that hasn't been seen very much at all is Gerasimov. And we discussed on Sunday how there were rumors that Gerasimov may have been functionally removed from command of the fighting in Ukraine in favor of Teplinsky. But apparently those rumors didn't sit well. And so the Russian Ministry of Defense released a video of Gerasimov in his role, you know, commanding forces in Ukraine. So it's interesting that that video would come out almost in response to some of the rumors. The fourth item back is the translation of Popov's particular complaints. So if you'd like it in text form, War Translated has done that for you. You can check it out. And just because I like to provide sources, the fifth item back, Archer Abel has a whole thread on it. This particular entry includes the link to the Telegram channel where the audio recording was released. So you can look to that if you'd like. The sixth item back, so we're sort of moving down the power structures. How I've thought about it is we have the overview, we have the video of Gerasimov, we have Popov's complaints. Now we had an update on Surovikin. And this doesn't add a lot of information, but it's interesting that the chairman of the Duma's Armed Services Committee, Kartopolov, was sort of caught in the lobby of, I think, the Duma's building, and asked, have you been in touch with Surovikin? And his response was, oh no, he's resting, he's on vacation, which isn't a particularly, convincing argument, but it is interesting that he was so glib about it, given the rumors that are going on. So it appears that there was no effort made to say, oh, Surovikin's working, he is so busy that he just hasn't been able to make public appearances, he's fine. That's not the approach that they took. And so it's pretty clear that he's dismissive of whatever position Surovikin's in. The last item in this block, with the seventh item back in the nest, is a tweet from the Wall Street Journal. And so they released this article yesterday as their exclusive, that they now have sources who are informing them that shortly after the Wagner revolt, apparently a fair number of top-ranking Russian officers were brought in for investigation, and up to 15 have been demoted or removed from command. And so there was speculation that there might be a bit of a purge. Some of the high priority names besides Surovikin didn't appear to be affected, but now we're hearing that apparently there was a broader effort that caught up, several dozen people in investigation. But I'll pause and put up some more material in a moment. Chris, did you want to come in with your question?
Yeah, I had a question regarding to the Ukrainian soldier from who was training in Germany, because I read his threads, and this is like a question directed to anyone with more military experience. So in the beginning of the war, especially, there was a lot of people making fun of Russian soldiers for using their cell phones, which enabled Ukrainians to target them. From what I gathered, that was basically a lot of thanks to them using the Ukrainian cell phone network. But isn't there electronic warfare equipment that will be able to pick up if Ukrainian soldiers are using like iPads or cell phones near the front line? And isn't that one of the reasons that NATO soldiers does not use cell phones in that way? I'm just asking because I get that we might be behind when it comes to drones because we haven't been in a land warfare like Ukraine is. So we're probably way behind on tactics and stuff like that. But to use paper instead of cell phones, like in the that seems to make sense from my point of view to avoid electronic warfare equipment and getting targeted. Or am I wrong?
So we have a couple of knowledgeable people on the panel, which is great. We'll go to radio and nukes and then Constantine.
I think that as far as just in electronic warfare, I want to make sure I say this in a way that doesn't accidentally put anything out there, but I think you'll find that just through 500 plus days of warfare that they have figured out what works and what doesn't through multiple different means. And sorry, I'm postulating in my head here. The use of Starlink, the use of cellular away from the front line, and knowing when to put. I have seen several documents on the Russian side about how to put the phone into, to turn everything off and put it in airplane mode and this and that to keep it from emitting. So I think it's basically just SOP now to they've learned through trial and error essentially how to mitigate the problems.
Yeah, I'll admit that I don't have much insight into how the Ukrainian sort of tablets for their battle management systems work in terms of locking them down from emissions. But Constantine might have insight into that. So Constantine, please go ahead.
Yeah, I want to give you 1 second because I have a nasty animal with you. 1 second.
Sure.
Yeah, I have a huge cicada flying around me, and my wife is freaking out. I think this cicada is last now. But what I wanted to say is that the maps. There is an electronic, and there is there are 3 layers right now of how you can navigate yourself and orient yourself in the locality. First of all, there is something that you have no map, you have no anything. That's your objective things that are like trees, buildings. Sky, stars, whatever it is that you can see. Then there is a map. Then there is a satellite with the navigational system, with the tablets, with the computers that you can utilize. And none of them cancel each other. People have to understand this, that because you have satellites with the tablets, it does not mean that you should not be capable to orient yourself using such things as just places that you have seen on your way and you memorize them. Things like stars or things like sun, because at any point, any of those systems that you have can malfunction. And I'm not joking if you think that the standard thing is that the battery can die on your tablet, which happens so many times that you cannot imagine. Even people try to keep the extra spare power banks with them, but even those die, they break a lot because those batteries don't live well in winter, especially. Then when we talk about paper maps, it's an extra thing that you should know that they get destroyed even more. There is moisture that gets in, the maps get destroyed all the time. Then you lose them, you forget to take them, you simply, when you've been bombarded and you're trying to pull out the map and understand what to do, you simply can't focus, or simply you don't have a place simply where to, pull it out properly and look at it. And of course there are things like, stars, and don't laugh at it, don't think it's funny. There is a compass that you can carry with yourself. There are stars. There are trees. There are big trees. There are some communication towers that you use as your, or I don't know how to say it. I mean, the orienters that you orient, that you use to, as a landmark, basically. And you can lose those as well, depending on where you are. You can slide into a ditch where you don't see much. You can have troubles with your vision. There are many things when using it. So all those things, they complement each other. And what rangers, for example, they're training. You said the rangers will training them. They teach them the basics. And there is one thing that is good about it is that when you know the basics, it's so easy to step it up that you cannot imagine. If you know how to use the stars and your landmarks without any map, then when you have the map, it's going to be so easy for you to learn those maps. Then when you learn the maps, like paper maps, and you know how to use the natural landmarks, then it's super easy for you to switch to the tablet. And it makes tablets are easier, but it does not mean that all the things that are about it are canceled. You gotta know. I'm myself, former military as well, not huge experience, of course, but I'm a software engineer as well, and I gotta say that as a software engineer, first you learn the algorithms, then later in your career you learn that there are already libraries that already have those algorithms implemented, and you just gotta use them. It does not mean that your knowledge of algorithms is useless. It actually complements everything that you do. So they give them this strength, and you must understand that's how things work. At first, not every student understands it, but it's super important. It's super important, and it comes to you with learning, and it comes with you with experience. Later in combat, you will understand when others fail, you will succeed because you have this lower level knowledge. We call it lower level in software, but in military, I'm not sure how to say it in English, but it only helps. So and this guy's experience was exclusively positive. The things that he didn't like, it's like standard military stuff. You just you look at it and you think I can make this better probably, and you give your feedback. Doesn't mean it's bad. It does not mean it's bad. So this is all I wanted to say. And for a really long round here.
Well, thanks, Konstantin. We appreciate your experienced insight, given you were on the in the fighting there years ago, and that idea that understanding the basics and being able to work with the paper versions first is definitely important. But I suppose the electronics that the Ukrainians use are just, an additional tool in the toolbox.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add, you don't know how many failures there were because we over-relied on this. It's a standard story if you speak with Ukrainians that have failure stories that we just used to hearing all the success, but there are a lot of failure stories, and those failure stories usually start like that. We don't have the batteries, and keep those things in mind when we're discussing. It's very important because we focusing on the success stories does not always bring the full picture.
And while that training issue about electronics is anecdotal, I'm also aware that it's probably picked up and used a bit more heavily by people who have their own ideas about how Western militaries should adapt. So it's partly used for a purpose as opposed to just neutrally. We'll keep going with updates. So the last block was on disruption in Russian command with regard to people being moved around, Surovkin, Popov, and so on. This next section is on some Russian commanders recently who have been killed. So it includes some very senior commanders. The first tweet up in the nest here is from an account that just tracks Russian officers who have been killed in Ukraine, which, I mean, there have been so many that it's actually helpful to have a standalone group focused on it. So this individual who was killed was Lieutenant General and the Deputy Commander of the Southern Military District, so really quite senior. And you'll see that his death was being confirmed by a number of Russian sources. And apparently that was at a hotel, and I've seen some speculation that if a lieutenant general was killed while there, it's likely that many other members of his staff would have been present, and so there may have been some other notable officers as casualties, even though we haven't been hearing very much about that yet. If you have heard about other senior officers who may have been killed in the same strike, just as corroboration, that would be interesting. Please let us know. The second post in the nest, not quite a senior commander, but a former submarine commander who was acting as recruiter in the Russian city of Krasnodar was shot and killed. He was out for his morning run, and so there were a couple of interesting angles that come from this. There hasn't been specific claim of responsibility. However, if you have a look at the third item back in the nest, you'll see that Ukraine's defense intelligence doesn't take responsibility, but they do make reference to several details, including the type of gun used, the weather in the park at the time of the shooting, and the fact that there were no witnesses. And so they could be passing these facts along, but it seems like they have a fair bit of knowledge about the circumstances of the killing. Which people are using to draw inference. You may also have seen some tweets going around talking about how this former submarine commander was wearing a fitness tracker during his morning run. And we have data, like information on that in a moment. But then in particular, I can't recall the name of the device. It's something like the Strata. Apparently on the public page that posts the route, people can comment on the route if you don't have your security settings, so it's visible to all. And some people noted that an account liked the route, and the account that liked it was set up with the name Kirilo Budanov, which is the name of the Ukrainian military intelligence leader. And a lot of people just they don't think Budanov was actually following this individual route. And that it's trolling, but I just wanted to mention that that's going around, and my strong suspicion is that it was just somebody who immediately after hearing about it did a quick search, hearing the individual was out, the submarine commander was out for a jog, did a quick search on spec that he may have had data shared like this and then very quickly set up an account in the name of Budanov. But there it is. Well, I'll go to hands in just a moment. But the last item in this block, it's the fourth tweet back in the nest, is a report that Bellingcat put together a few years ago because this Strava fitness tracker and those like it, like I think Fitbit and so on, have been implicated in unintentional data leaks, including by U.S. forces, where both, I think it was in Iraq around, a forward operating base. And then I think several, security officers on diplomatic missions. Similarly, their sort of morning jogging routes have been publicly posted through these apps. And so Bellingcat, having encountered it before, has actually written on it. So if you'd like some background on it, it's there for you. Jane, please go ahead. Jane may not be there.
Sorry.
No,
No, I was just 2 screens away. Just that it was very interesting to me when I saw that, because I am a member of Strava. It's actually a social media website for athletes. And, it's a number of things, but it allows you, if you link your fitness device or a Garmin sports watch or a Whoop strap or whatever into it, it will automatically, if you have a GPS, show your link in real time when you're running as it processes. I'm sure there's some delay on it, but it's always struck me as something that could be a little bit dangerous if you weren't careful with it, if you were traveling, something like that. And when I saw that, I'm like, yikes, that's not necessarily a good thing. But yeah, it's a very interesting sort of social media site for athletes. And yeah, I'm sure this guy's site went out, or his track went out, and that's how they caught up with him. But kind of a creepy geolocation effort in almost real time. But what's going on within the Russian command structure right now, fascinating stuff.
I'll point out, so in the Medusa article that I shared, it put some other material up, so it's now like the 6th or 7th item back. But in that Medusa article, they're noting that the Russians have arrested a Ukrainian individual, accusing him of being the killer. Now, I don't know. Usually, I would immediately discount Russian claims on this front, that they're just trying to find somebody to blame. To that end, I'll make the point, just because the sub-commander's data was being posted publicly doesn't mean that he was actually being tracked in that way, and this could possibly be random street crime. I understand, given that he's a high priority target, or a high profile target, that you think the odds are a little higher that it was targeted. But it's also possible that it was random, or perhaps not random, but not related to his role as a commander. Yeah, Jane, go ahead.
The only thing I'd say about this is you could get very sloppy if you ran the same place over the course of time. If you were in that port, or if he was there frequently. Yeah, the times you ran, if you were a consistent runner or cyclist or whatever, the times you ran and where you ran could be, a matter of very public record. And all you had to do was check Strava and know who the guy is, and there you go. But like you said, it could have been a random thing, although it would be a pretty amazing coincidence to me right now that anybody within Russian command would just be the victim of a hit on the street, given what's going on in Russia.
Yeah, and I make the point that the Ukrainian man who has been arrested, normally I would think that he would be a patsy. I still think that's possible. Somebody noted that apparently the individual who has been arrested was previously attended and I think may have received some kind of recognition for efforts he took to resist or assist in the recovery immediately after in the city of Bucha. And so that would suggest that, number one, that he's very supportive of the Ukrainians. I'm seeing some hands, so hopefully I'm not wrong about that. But that he's very supportive of the Ukrainians, which would beg the question, why would he then be in Krasnodar? And it also begs the question about how the Russians let him across the border. But I'm going to go to hands. So we'll go to Kitty as co-host first and then Konstantin.
Well, I was just going to say by the same token, Jane, if you were in that position and you knew that Putin was out to kill commanders and such, why would you keep that to your routine? I think that's pretty careless. No?
Because you're a neurotic athlete that's consistent in the way that you do things. And sometimes, oddly enough, your athletic habits can be much more consistent than your life habits or what's going on in your world. It's the one thing you can control. And that's what makes being an athlete sort of a cool thing. But, not this time, not for him, at least potentially.
Konstantin, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, was there a confirmation that he was Ukrainian?
Yes, that's what's being reported, is that he's I want to make sure I get the age right. I thought it said he was like a early 60s Ukrainian citizen. His name is included, if you have a look in the, let me just find it here. It's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's the 7th item back in the nest, the article from Medusa. He's a 64-year-old Ukrainian citizen, and Stanislav Ruzitsky, apparently. Or excuse me, no, that's Stanislav Ruzitsky is the submarine commander. The name of the accused Ukrainian is in the article. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so I try to build a flow to the way we cover the news. So the idea was to flow from, the offensive into disorder in the Russian command, part of which is just infighting, part of which is the fallout from the Wagner revolt. And so I wanted to flow into brief updates on Wagner. Just for administrative purposes, normally we hold these talks for about 3 hours. So we're about 10 minutes out from that. I may run about 10 minutes over, but I think that once we cover the Wagner developments, it then moves into diplomatic matters around the NATO summit. So I think what we'll do is we'll save most of that for Sunday. Because these are sort of persistent political questions, they'll still be relevant then, and we may have some more insight into some of the different players' motivations. It's kind of a shame we didn't get deeper into the conversation, but we had a great talk with some of our community members on projects research that they did, and I think it's important to highlight that as well. So it's just sort of the contrasting priorities of the space. But do drop by to our conversation on Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern time if you'd like to hear that. We'll probably, since we want to cover the Black Sea Grain Initiative and some of the politics, we'll start with that, and we'll probably leave more of the military equipment offensive matters later in the space, so we can address some of the material we didn't get to tonight. But we will run through 2 blocks of updates on Wagner. So starting with the first item on the left of the nest, one of the surprise announcements that was made by the Kremlin in the last few days is that apparently Putin met with Prigozhin and his other Wagner commanders on June the 29th, just a few days after the revolt occurred. And at the time, when asked about Prigozhin's whereabouts, the Kremlin spokesman Peskov just said, I'm not at liberty to say, I don't really know. And this is when people were talking about the fact that he was supposed to be moving to Belarus, but as we were reporting, people tracking his aircraft saw it flying to Belarus and then back and forth to Russia, Moscow and St. Petersburg several times. So this kind of lined up with what was being seen from open source information. If you look through that thread from Sam Bendet, who summarizes it, the report the Russians gave, they talk about how reportedly Putin wanted to hear from senior Wagner commanders about what they did during the revolt and some of their motivations during it. Now, I don't entirely doubt that the meeting happened. However, I have seen some interesting political analysis that suggests the fact that it wasn't announced right away and it's only being brought up now may suggest that Putin wanted to have the discussion for private purposes to try to work things out, but there was uncertainty about how things would resolve, which is why they weren't upfront about it immediately. And the fact that they're disclosing it now may suggest that there has been a greater smoothing over of the results of the Wagner revolt, which it partly is maybe supported by Prigozhin seeming to be at liberty in Russia for the last, week and a half. And that perhaps the report that Putin met with them is meant to present Putin as a great, diplomat who's trying to be magnanimous and understand the motivation of those who opposed him. And so, don't discount that this has a political motivation to it and that the description of what happened in the meeting may be structured for political ends. But it's still an interesting data point. The next significant development regarding Wagner was the Russian Ministry of Defense reported on Wagner turning over many of their heavy weapons. So the second post in the nest is an article from the War Zone that goes into a breakdown of what some of those weapons were, including tanks, SAM systems, but then also I think they said something like 20,000 small arms. So it was a significant amount of weaponry that was reported to have been turned over. We can't verify the total scope. However, if you have a look at the third item back in the nest, the Russian Ministry of Defense released some video that showed, tanks, other vehicles, artillery pieces and the like. So it's certainly, assuming these are actually Wagner pieces that are being seized, it seems like significant numbers of weapons are being taken into Ministry of Defense control. In keeping with that, this is actually a quick update on Wagner's activities in Africa, where this is one report from the New York Times. There were several from other outlets continuing to discuss how Prigozhin's ties through Wagner in Africa are so deep and they have so many specialists there that it will be very difficult for the Kremlin to take control of those networks with any kind of speed, which is what we have been hearing for the last week or so and highlighting in our conversation. We're hearing more of those sorts of reports. Last point in this block, and then I'll go to Hans, is I mentioned a moment ago tracking Prigozhin's aircraft and how that seems to be matching up with reports on the ground now about meetings with Lukashenko, meetings with Putin. The most recent report from 2 days ago was that Prigozhin's business jet had once again returned to Belarus. And so I haven't heard an update from that. So he may be in Belarus at the moment. Exit, go ahead.
One of the reports that we had heard a couple of days ago was that it could be that Wagner was going to continue operating in Africa in the same way that they were, in the same fashion that they were before, but wouldn't be continuing to operate like in Russia, Europe type area. And so when you're looking at facts to kind of fit into the piece of the puzzle, it's possible that the turning over of all that equipment in Russia could lead you to believe that particular story maybe has some more validity to it. But as always, wait for more.
Yeah, and so in this last block of coverage on Wagner, there's a point we'll get to in a moment, maybe because it makes sense to cover it now. Yeah, so the second item back in the nest, taken along with the turnover of the Wagner heavy equipment, there was a video going around, or excuse me, it's now the third item back in the nest. It's the tweet from Jeremy, JC the Music Man. A video going around of Prigozhin speaking, saying that Wagner forces had come out from the front line of fighting on June the 5th, and that he planned to have them go back to fighting in Ukraine on August the 5th. And that was going around, suggesting that perhaps Wagner was going to continue to be involved as a force in Ukraine. But this tweet, third item back from Jeremy, he found a source on a Russian news site earlier, which is an early publication of this video, and it was filmed prior to the Wagner revolt, when the incentives of Wagner and the Kremlin were theoretically aligned, but it's would be irrelevant given the events that followed. So it's important to pay attention to when it's old video. So that August 5th claim doesn't appear to have any validity. We'll go to Jane, and then I'll keep running through updates.
Yeah, I actually saw that video, and also saw one where basically the same thing that you said, and I know that there was some suggestion that Chechens were going to be, taking their place, but they'd be back at some point, which sounded really kind of specious. And I think, my thinking process, and again, there's too much backstory missing here, but it seems like Prigozhin is in the safest place for him and for Putin, for a whole lot of people, if he's in Africa. He's just far enough away, he can operate on his own, do what he's done before, have a very positive relationship, or at least a good relationship, with several countries in Africa. And my guess is he has, as has been mentioned, he's getting hardware. I'm sure that he had money stashed away, and I just can't see there being a happy ending if he remains in the, Ukraine picture in any way, or for that matter, in Belarus or Russia. Just too many heads to bang into each other, and one too many leaders that want camera time. And I think that right now Putin is dying to keep the camera focused on him. And Prigozhin is somebody that is knocking him in the knees, and I think that that's a problem for him. So the further away he is, the better. At least that's my guess right now.
Thanks, Jane. So I'm going to run through the last block of updates on Wagner. Just before I do that, I'll remind you that our next conversation will be this Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. The first item that I've put in the nest is a link to that, so that you can set your reminder now if you like. And then also just a reminder for those who may have joined us recently or are new to the space, the second item in the nest is a link to the YouTube channel where friends of ours are streaming this conversation. So if you ever miss one of our conversations and you'd like to catch up or go back to listen to a topic that we discussed in the past, you can always go to that YouTube channel in order to catch up there. And just, I know that I have already mentioned that on Sunday we will discuss diplomatic issues, the Black Sea Grain Initiative, Turkey, the NATO summit, many things we didn't get to today. But in case you'd like to get a head start on that or a summary with material that generally gets fairly close to sources, the first item in the nest now, you can click on it and it links to the thread with the material I had gathered to discuss that we just didn't get to. So you can always read ahead. Okay, so the last block of material on Wagner, starting with the fourth item back in the nest. It's a tweet by Eric Toller of Bellingcat. And this is an interesting collision of good reputation coming up against uncertainty, which I'll explain in that Eric is a very reliable researcher. And what he highlighted in this tweet was a report from the outlet called Project Media. And Eric specifically says that this is they're a legitimate source. And their report claims that anonymous sources who are close to Prigozhin have reported that he is suffering from cancer in the abdomen. And Eric then goes on to speculate that photographs that were recently released from Prigozhin's home during the raid on his home included a room with medical equipment in it, and that perhaps that might be related to cancer treatments. But this is where the reliability issue gets bumped into. So another friend of our space, Marcus, who does lots of ship tracking, flight tracking, if you look in the replies to Eric, put the pictures from Prigozhin's home up and said, look, this medical equipment doesn't look like the kind of medical equipment you would use to treat cancer. It looks like it's fairly bargain respiratory equipment. And so maybe what was set up in Prigozhin's home was a treatment room in the event of COVID. So looking at the photographs, I have to agree with Marcus, but just because Eric Toller's speculation that room might have been for cancer treatment, even if not true, that doesn't necessarily cut against the Project Media report that Prigozhin may have cancer. However, that's the sort of speculation I wouldn't normally raise. All the time we hear, oh, Putin has this disease or that disease. I raise it only because it is Eric Toller, who is reliable, and he's specifically saying that Project Media is, also reliable. So I leave it in your hands. Related to that idea, though, the the fifth item back in the nest. He apparently was also reported in that same article from Project that Prigozhin has said to those close to him with regard to the mutiny that I went crazy, suggesting that it wasn't a rational thing. But others on hearing that, analysts have pointed out that it seems like some Wagner heavy equipment was pre-positioned, that there were requests put into the Russian Ministry of Defense to be able to move Wagner heavy equipment across the Russian border that were put in several days in advance. And there was the whole pretext for the initial movement where Wagner claimed that Russian MOD sources had struck one of their bases with a strike, presumably a missile. And all of that would cut against the narrative of I went crazy, unless Prigozhin's crazy is I acted irrationally for a period of weeks. So most analysts I've seen talking about it suggest that it's sort of like after the fact rationalization on his part, perhaps to minimize his engagement. If there does seem to be an easing of tension, as suggested by the meeting between Putin and Prigozhin, and the fact that Prigozhin's traveling back and forth between Russia and Belarus, perhaps if he's claiming this publicly that I just went crazy, or he's saying it to private sources, but if he's discussing it openly, that may be the narrative that they're working toward, that it was irrational passion, which, you know, may be more excusable by Putin than a premeditated, you know, revolt. But I see that we're being joined by Gurney, who may have an opinion on this.
Well, I don't have an opinion, but I don't like to put a hypothetical out there, but it's going to, for a thought experiment, to put a hypothetical out there that could be plausible, and just let me just go with it, if you can see where I'm going with it, not to put it out there as speculation, but just to say many things can be plausible, and just because you can't prove it. So it's why I kind of stay away from the speculation on Prigozhin. For instance, and again, I don't believe this, but let me just put an argument forth that you know might make it tough to understand what's happening or what's occurring with Prigozhin or any of that in terms of Russia. So, for instance, if we were to take at face value what occurred, what is being said here, I could also, you know, posit a plausible alternative to say perhaps Prigozhin was working with Putin if he felt there was a weakness and said, I need to understand who my inner circles are, and went through a Maskarovka to say, hey, look, this appears to be a mutiny. And while I could put that forth, it might not have occurred. It might not even be remotely likely. However, it could be just as plausible that that Prigozhin was working with Putin to put forth what looks like a mutiny, whereas it was used to ferret out moles and people that might not 100% support either the state or Putin. And I say that because it's plausible. Again, I don't want to put any merit behind it to say I believe in that or I don't believe in it. But I'm just saying is a lot of people in the Twitter space assume they think they know what's going on or it's changed slightly or this and that. But at the end of the day, I think we have no idea what actually has occurred, and we may never get there without really, really, you know, definitive, substantive stuff. And even then, how are you going to know to trust it? But to be fair, it could have been a state operation with Prigozhin on the surface looking like a mutiny. Or even, you know, not to just ferret out that, but to understand what a global response to a perceived mutiny would be. And again, remember during when that happened, NATO and most Western nations urged restraint. Because again, I don't think most Western powers are going to want to show their cards in the event of contingencies of if a mutiny is occurring. Because one, can they ascertain that it's actually occurring? And two, whether it is or isn't occurring, do they want to show their cards as to what the response might be in terms of contingency operations? So again, many things could be possible with what occurred, and I'm only bringing this up to say, you know, I could posit many different theories of what could have occurred, and they sound plausible. And then that's not a criticism I'm sharing. I'm just saying I'm offering it as conversation here because I know we talk about that. But that's one of those areas where, you know, I'd like for open source to get some of that, but it's very, very difficult to even, you know, to even have us ascertain heads from tails.
Well, so your speculation is kind of in keeping with the type of speculation or the nature of speculation that I've included in this block, you know, about claims Prigozhin has cancer, Prigozhin claiming that he went crazy. So I hear you. The only reason I even get into this level of speculation, which I generally avoid, is because it's still so wildly uncertain. But also, since the conversation's going around on some of these fronts, I think it's worth mentioning, if only to try and put constraints on it, like that idea about the medical equipment in Prigozhin's home appearing not to be related to cancer, as was suggested, you know. So to the extent we can constrain even a little bit, some of these things, that it can be helpful. So I do have another 2 or 3 points here that are a little bit speculative, which I understand is outside the norm, but I think they're still worth mentioning. So the 7th item back in the nest is a tweet from, it's translated by War Translated, but it's a post that was put up by Igor Girkin, who again is not a good person, led Russian forces, Russian aligned forces in the Donbass for many years, but now is in a role of critic. He seems to be one of the few who can stand a little outside the system and say some honest things, but he also gets wildly speculative sometimes. In this case, he has said he believes that some of the goals of Prigozhin's mutiny have been successful, and that in fact he thinks that power may actually be shifting toward Prigozhin. But this is getting into sort of a level of Kremlin tea leaf reading that I just don't have enough experience to evaluate. It's just, this is so contrary to everything else we're hearing about Wagner turning over their heavy equipment and, you know, forces being transferred here and transferred there, to have somebody come out and say, well, Prigozhin is actually winning over backing at other levels. You know, I'm not in a position to evaluate it, but I think it's the sort of dark horse item to keep on your radar. The last 2 items, which are the 8th and 9th back in the nest, relate to a claim around the Voronezh 45 site, which is a nuclear weapon storage site that was along the route that the Wagner forces traveled as they headed to Moscow. And so the 8th item back in the nest, it's a tweet by Hans Christensen, Nukestrat, who is a responsible expert on nuclear weapons. And he spoke with Reuters to put together, they're putting together this article about the fact that the Wagner personnel did approach the Voronezh 45 site. Now, I think the term that Reuters used is to say that they neared the Russian nuclear base. And so Nukestrat was essentially talking about nuclear weapons security issues more broadly. However, that set the scene. So this is a fairly moderate article. That set the scene. Kirilo Budanov then came out and released a video in which he said that the Wagner forces actually went to the site and were at the site. And he goes into a bit of speculation in that video where he talks about there were smaller nuclear weapons and that it was Wagner's intention was to get their hands on them. But Budanov says that the storage for the weapons was closed and that the Wagner personnel never got to them. He doesn't say why. He doesn't say whether they were prevented, whether there was fighting, but he does say that they went to the site. I'm partly raising this because there were theories that went around at the time, promoted by a big account, Igor Sushko, saying that Wagner had actually captured the site, and then speculating, and I understand he was speculating that perhaps Wagner had goals associated with the site, and that's why they stopped their advance. I'm only bringing this up because Sushko, I think, rightly got criticism for that position because, it was raising the implication that there may have been nuclear weapons loose, which is something that, the danger of sites like that, several people raised in responsible ways, which I think is worthwhile. But suggesting that Wagner may have actually obtained a weapon without evidence is, a risky thing to say. It causes confusion. And then after Budanov put his video out about Wagner attending the site, Sushko came back and said, oh, well, look, I've been proven right. And so that 9th item back in the nest is my tweet, where I said to him, normally I stay out of these things. I don't like to get into drama, but given that I think he was irresponsible initially and I didn't say anything because others were covering it, But given that he then said, well, Budanov has totally justified me, he did nothing of the kind, right? Budanov said they did not get weapons, and he doesn't say they captured the site. He says they got to the site, which is very different from taking control of it. If they took control of it, why didn't they follow through under Sushko's reasoning? So I said to Sushko, like, look, here's what you say. Here's what Budanov says. They're not the same thing. He then suggested I was illiterate, and I said, well, Budanov appears to be contradicting your theory, so I don't see why you're celebrating it. And then he blocked me. So it had been a long time. I had been careful not to. I knew his ego is very fragile, but I had been careful not to engage too much. And in this case, I thought I was pretty gentle and reasonable, but apparently not enough. So I'm highlighting that for a couple of reasons. To number one, tell you the Reuters article is responsible and neutral. Budanov making this claim is interesting. I'm not sure his motivation, or if he's just reporting the facts as he understands them. There are many details there that you'd think you would want to come out, including why were they stopped, how far did they get, that Budanov has not commented on. If his comments are to a political end, potentially to cause greater strife within Russian forces, there are interesting implications there. So there's that aspect of Budanov said it. What are Budanov's motivations? And then there is highlighting, be very careful where you get your information sources, because I know a huge number of people follow Sushko, and usually I ignored it. I couldn't in this case, but he's wrong a huge amount of the time. Konstantin, go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you that you said that ignore Sushko. No matter how pro-Ukrainian he is, people have to keep those things in mind. You gotta refine your sources. If it sounds like you want it to be true, it does not mean it is true. And that account just uses this. A feeling, that emotions of the people, that they want it to be true, and he's going to post it, and he needs this engagement, and he needs to grow the account. So keep those things in mind, and thank you for bringing it up. That's because it's super important, because he hurts Ukraine more than helps.
Yeah, and so with that caution, we'll probably wind up our conversation for tonight. Again, I wish we had gotten through more, but I think we have lots of material to discuss on Sunday. And so I'll say thank you to everybody who came to join us tonight. I hope you do join us then. I'd love to have lots of conversation, discussion with the audience on Sunday. I'll say thank you to all of our speakers, particularly to John Ridge, to Radio and Nukes, and to Cameron, who presented some of the work they've done in the last few days. I really appreciate seeing people coming together, to cooperate on that work. And it sounds like all of you have other projects on the go. And again, if you'd like to contribute, help any of these guys out, please reach out to them. And we'll try and incorporate you as much as we can. And thank you to all of our other speakers. Pretty well everybody who came up to speak tonight has been following the war since the beginning, and I'd encourage you to check out their profiles, consider giving them a follow. And thanks to my co-host, to Jacoby, who was up with us most of the evening. I think she just had to recently drop. And to Riverside Kitty. Without your guys' help, it would be extremely hard to hold these spaces. So with that, I hope to see you guys on Sunday, and have a good night.